Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything, because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. How many? I asked excitedly. Oh, there are 6 puppies. I'm looking at them right now. They're so adorable. Wilhelmina looks as proud as Punch. Oh, there's one more. It's coming out right now. I see the sack. She's tearing it open, eating it up. She's licking the puppy clean with her tongue. Oh, they're so cute. They're wiggling around, looking for Wilhelmina's teats. So there's 7 puppies. That's incredible. What colour are they? They're creamy, just like Wilhelmina. That means that Mrs. Phillips' golden retriever must be the father. She never got him neutered, you know. So they're all golden retriever puppies. That's amazing. An unlikely accident. That's what I'm thinking. Oh, please can't you come over now to see them? I really want you to. They're so beautiful. I glanced at the clock. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm in my bedroom doing my homework. I promised I'd work until 6 o'clock. Can't you creep out of the window, Julia? Your mother will never know. You can pop over for 15 minutes. She'll never know you're missing. Please come now. All right, I'll see you in a tick, but I can't be long or my mother will kill me. I knew I shouldn't be sneaking out of our ranch-style farmhouse at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but I was eager to see Wilhelmina's puppies. I knew if I was very quick about it, my parents would be none the wiser. I squeezed out of my bedroom window and dashed towards the shed where I retrieved my bicycle. In seconds I was cycling down the country road towards my best friend's farmhouse. I had no regrets seeing Wilhelmina and her 7 beautiful puppies, as it had been so exciting, as the golden retriever looked as proud as Punch about her 7 little younglings, and I was in total awe of these beautiful puppies, so much so that I'd completely lost track of time. I could see that the sun was setting. Before long, the dark shadows of early twilight would infuse the sky with an inky blackness, so I needed to make tracks home as quickly as possible. I didn't fancy riding home in the dark. If my parents found out I was missing from my bedroom and was guilty of failing to do my homework, they would not be best pleased with me. I could find myself being grounded for a week or more. I climbed onto my bicycle, cycling hurriedly down the road, pedalling as fast as I possibly could, as tormenting, inauspicious pictures of my mother's peaked face whirled around in my head, ominous visions of her reprimanding me. My mother could be as tough as old boots when she got mad about something. The last thing I wanted was to be on the receiving end of her wrath. My father could be very forgiving, but my mother was like a dog with a bone when her feathers got ruffled. You could rest assured that if you did something wrong, you would constantly be reminded of your iniquity for weeks to come. I was ever grateful that there were street lights on the asphalt road, so at least I could see more clearly. It had grown dark, as if someone had turned the dimmer switch to low. It seemed like only moments before the tangerine orange sunset had dappled everything in a golden glaze. But now things had become menacing, foreboding. I could see the baleful, shadowy silhouettes of the red maple and red budwood trees on either side of the embankment, swaggering minaciously in the breeze. Even these gentle giants had taken on a sinister, portentous pose. I felt as if I was being watched by pernicious eyes that drilled through my back like jagged knives. I felt instinctively that something was very wrong, as even the crickets and frogs had not started to sing yet. My gaze was fixated on the trees. I could swear I could see foreboding, airy shadows creeping in the looming darkness, and hear sinister whispers calling my name provocatively in the wind. Julia, Julia, Julia. Was I imagining this, I wondered? My parents, like many West Virginian elders, did not like us being out in the darkness, as stories abounded of myths, fables, legends, and bizarre accounts of peculiar beings that haunted the woods at the dead of night. But up until now, I had never given those thoughts a moment's credence. I thought the stories were made up by well-meaning adults who wanted to be certain that their children would not go exploring the woods at night. In a trice I saw something obscure but tall and dark standing in the middle of the road. But as I neared my approach, I saw it clearly. It was a direful-looking creature, easily over 6 foot tall. It looked like a human, covered in thick, short, cropped hair, but with a dog-like muzzle and full feathered tail, while the hands on this thing had acute, razor-sharp talons that were so serrated they could tear you limb from limb, easily searing flesh as seamlessly as a butcher's roast. In that moment the adrenaline coursed through my veins as the creature glared at me through these antagonistic, malevolent, baleful red eyes. It growled at me so fiercely that I nearly fell off my bike. I thought I was staring into the eyes of the devil himself, or one of his helpers that stokes up the flames of hell. For a second I wondered if I was actually seeing a demon. I knew I had to get away as fast as I possibly could, because this thing, whatever in God's name it was, wanted my blood. Of that I was in no doubt, for the eldritch look it gave me was a threatening kind of hungry, predatory look that was just so horrifying. My heart was thumping so violently. I was losing my balance on my bike as the fear that coursed through my veins undermined my good judgment. I quickly turned around in the middle of the road to ride back towards my friend's house. I couldn't ride past this gruesome creature. There was no way I could. But I could hear it running after me. It grabbed my bike, began to shake it hard. While I began to scream, my breathing quickened, my fear escalated, seizing my entire body with a terror that heightened my ability to ride my bicycle even faster. But the creature was holding my bike down so hard that I was pedalling away as if I was on a stationary bike. Then I heard the unwelcome purr of an engine, but the truck never stopped. I remember going, "No! Please, no!" After that my memory goes blank. But I was to learn from Mrs. Rolfe, who was driving down the road at the time of the collision, that she was tapping a message in her cell phone to her husband Lucas. "I'm on my way now. I'll be home in 10 minutes. For a moment her attention was diverted off the road. A moment was all it took. That's all it ever takes. A second of distraction. Then your life can be changed forever. She then heard the awful screeching sound. She realised she'd run over something in the road. Something very substantial. She'd heard the metal of a bike being gnarled, folded, buckled and pulverised by her own vehicle. Mrs. Ralph's pulse began to race at 100 miles an hour as she slammed down her brake as hard as she could with her foot. She climbed hurriedly out of her truck. Her heart was filled with trepidation and terror as she inspected the dreadful carnage. She gasped in horror. She found my body lying in a crumpled heap in the middle of the road, my eyes staring vacantly into space like a dead fish, my body as floppy and unflinching as a rag doll, my skin the colour of death, my disfigured bicycle a mangled wreck. She let out a terrified scream. "Oh, my God! Please, no! This can't be happening!" She ran towards me, shaking my body as vigorously as she could, hoping against all hope that she could wake me out of my enforced slumber. But my body just flopped lifelessly. My legs and arms dangled, drooping in strange angles. Mrs. Rolfe was gripped by feelings of overwhelming dread, while a shameful guilt stabbed at her gut. "I should have been watching the road," she told herself angrily. "I'm a bloody idiot. Look what I've done. Tonight I've destroyed lives. starting with my very own. I can live with what I've done to myself, but not what I've done to an innocent family. I can never forgive myself for this, she thought. Julia, it's me, it's Mrs. Ralph. Are you all right, Julia? Blood was pouring out of my mouth. My eyes rolled in the back of my head. She checked for a pulse. She could hear a low murmur. Frantically, Mrs. Rolfe grabbed her phone, calling the ambulance. Come at once! I've run over a girl in the middle of the road. The girl's name is Julia Clarkson. Yes, I can feel a pulse, but I'm scared. I think she's fading. She might die. Calm down, madam. We're on our way. Please stay with the young girl. Mrs. Ralph had to be sedated when the ambulance arrived, as she had become a bag of nerves. It's all my fault, she was crying. I should have been paying attention to the road. Look what I've done. I was placed on a gurney and taken to the hospital by ambulance, but I remember nothing of that journey. Robert's account. It must have been about 6:15 when we could hear ambulance sirens in the distance. Even my mother wondered if someone had been in an accident. Oh dear, she reflected. Whoever they are, I do hope they're all right, and I hope it's not someone we know. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang to our home. It was unusual to have guests visiting our home this late in the evening, so I went to see who it was. My mother had answered the door. She was talking to a police officer. The blue warning lights on his vehicle were flashing in our driveway, alerting me to the fact that this was not a social visit by any manner of means. Something bad must have happened. I could hear the soft, urgent murmur of voices. The tone of the officer's solicitous voice was beleaguered and serious. His face looked exceedingly grave. His disheartened demeanour was very troubled. Something bad had happened, but who to, I wondered. You must have it wrong, my mother insisted. Julia's in her bedroom doing her homework. Sorry, ma'am, but it's definitely your daughter, Julia. She was knocked down by a car this evening. She's in hospital. Mrs. Rolfe ran her over. She knows your daughter very well. She says it was definitely Julia. I'm afraid your daughter was not very responsive. It looks very serious. The injuries are very, very bad. I'm sorry, ma'am, to be the bearer of such bad news. My mother's face grew as white as a sheet, her eyes round with horror. She oscillated her arms above her head and let out a shrill scream. My baby! My baby! Is she going to be all right? Calm down, madam, said the sheriff. Your daughter is in the very good hands at the hospital. They're doing everything they can for her. My baby! My baby! Cried my mother, the tears pouring down her face. I must go to her now. We will take you to the hospital now, ma'am, he said, escorting her out of the house. We were to learn that my sister had sneaked out of the house when she was supposed to be doing her homework to see the neighbours' new puppies, but she'd been knocked over by a car in the road when the driver, Mrs. Rolfe, had been momentarily distracted while she was texting her husband Lucas and failed to see Julia cycling in the road. But the odd thing about the account, that my sister was seen cycling towards her friend's farm when she'd been there only moments before, rather than cycling back towards home. We were to discover that my sister was in a coma, and she'd undergone multiple surgeries. No one was any the wiser whether she would make a full recovery or not, so both my parents were completely devastated. Over the next few weeks, while Julia was in hospital, my parents visited her regularly. I began to feel terribly alone. There was no structure in my life anymore. No relegated homework, no scheduled meal times. Everything in our lives had been turned upside down, topsy-turvy, inside out. My mother would spend countless hours at the hospital visiting Julia, but when she was at home she would pace around our house like a wildcat in a zoo enclosure, with her thoughts focused entirely upon Julia. Sometimes she barely noticed I was even there. She would stand there biting her nails nervously, staring vacantly into space, while my overwrought father wore a wounded, flustered expression on his face that was perpetually grim, as if he was carrying the weight of the world upon his shoulders. Ostensibly, the sorrowful, crushing energy in our home was like a soupy, torrid, humid atmosphere, birthed not by austere, unkind weather conditions outside our home, but the suffocating, muggy energy of our senseless despair and hopelessness, that made the climate within our home oppressive, abrasive, and insufferable. "We're going to have to pull our weight as a family. We need to be strong for Julia," my father would tell us, but it was easier said than done. People had been so kind. Well-wishers had sent us flowers and brought us home-cooked meals. I had personally visited my sister in hospital on a few occasions, but I didn't recognize her. It would seem her little body was covered in bandages and plasters, while she had tubes coming out of her mouth, heart monitors connected to her, along with all kinds of strange machines and devices. It was hard to even believe that this broken person in the hospital bed was actually Julia. It looked nothing like her. I could see by the morbid expressions on the doctors' faces that things had not improved. My sister's health was rapidly declining. The fear that my sister might never wake up hung over our head like an ever-present threat. They were the unarticulated words that no one ever dared to broach. No one ever said what if, as the very thought that Julia might not be coming home was too incomprehensible for us to even fathom. I began to feel very isolated, lonely and forsaken in my home, as my parents were never there for me. The compounding grief that my sister was now in a coma had hit my family so hard. It was as if every person in my household had been run over by a forklift truck and had been emotionally decimated, as if every part of us had been squashed into that asphalt road when my sister had that accident. My parents became disconnected, disengaged and almost divorced from their own lives. They were functioning on autopilot, so that everything was almost done robotically, like the washing, the cleaning and the shopping. My mother had become such a jittering bag of nerves that she'd been highly sedated by the doctor, who put her on some calming medication that made her become almost zombie-like. I knew I couldn't stand being in the house, so I began to spend a long period of time out in the woods. It offered me the perfect sanctuary and peace that I craved. It was an escapism from the chaotic environment of our broken lives that were as mangled and dishevelled as my sister lying in that hospital bed. My family lived in West Virginia, between the scenic views of the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Ohio River. We lived in a beautiful ranch-style home nestled in a pretty valley. Wherever you looked you would see trees, and yet more trees, the undulating curls of the mountains, and an endless expanse of perfect blue sky, where birds would often soar into the heavens, the most spectacular being the bald eagle. I'd even seen them dropping their young in the sky from time to time, and lifting them up again until the young eagles finally learnt how to fly. It was always breathtaking to watch them. It was on a Saturday morning that I arose early and prepared myself a picnic lunch. I was determined to escape the depressing melancholia that cloaked our home in a heaviness that was so tangible. I decided to take a little backpack with some lunchtime snacks to the woodgrove to spend the afternoon there. I tried to tell my incoherent mother about it, but as usual she seemed preoccupied. "I wonder how Julia's doing," she kept rambling on to herself in unintelligible mumbles as she stared vacantly out of the window, her mind 1,000 miles away. "Mum," I said. "Yes, dear," was her vacant response. "I'm going to the woods. I'm taking my lunch there." "Yes, dear," she said. In truth, I don't think she had even assimilated a single word I'd said. Both my dithery parents were beginning to annoy me. As they were so caught up in limbo, they were not even living their normal lives. My mother formerly had been a slightly overweight woman, with a round heart-shaped face, who dressed in bright cheerful colours, was effusive and positive. She was now a zombie. Since Julia's accident, she'd stopped eating, dropped several dress sizes, and become so skinny. She looked like a walking skeleton, her skin ghostly pale, her blue eyes almost faded, her hair tousled and unkempt, while my father had packed on the pounds, as he was always eating to suppress his emotions, or sloshing down copious amounts of beer to drown his sorrows. He would sit in front of the television drinking 6 packs of beer, sometimes getting inebriated. My grandmother had tried to knock some sense into my mother when she had stayed the weekend with us. She had chastised her own daughter. "Claudia, I know Julia's in the hospital, and yes, it is terrible what happened to her. But you need to get a grip, dear. You have a son that is anxious for your love. You are willfully ignoring him. Worse still, you're letting your own health slide. Look at you. You've lost so much weight. The way you're going, you'll make a catwalk model look fat. You need to start eating, dear." Of course, like everything else, my grandmother's warning words were like water off a duck's back, as my mother refused to listen, but continued to be cocooned in her own tortured world, where all her attention was focused on Julia. She hung on to every word the doctors would tell her, as if she was dangling on a cliff face, too terrified to let go in case she fell. I knew if I slipped out of the house, my parents wouldn't even know I was missing. Our home had become like a living morgue. It was as if my parents were living in a parallel universe. I said goodbye to my mother, who was sitting on the green and gold-upholstered couch in our living room, staring at a picture of my sister. "Mum," I repeated, "as I've told you 5,000 times already, I'm going now." "Yes, dear," was her response. I suppose I'd been secretly hoping for some kind of reaction, but none was forthcoming. She didn't seem to care what I was up to or where I was going, which was very upsetting. Never for a moment did she glance up at me. It was like she was a waxwork statue at Madame Tussauds, rigidly fixed on the photograph that she was looking at. But she was almost staring through the photograph, as if her eyes were actually made of glass. I could see my father mowing the turf in the backyard. He was wearing his blue jeans and plaid shirt, but like my mother, he was caught up in his own thoughts. I waved at him, but he barely acknowledged me. It left me feeling so unimportant, and as if I wasn't nearly as precious to them as my sister. I was beginning to resent her for consuming so much of my parents' time. I think I was actually jealous of her in some kind of warped way, as she was getting their undivided attention. Gone were the days when my mother asked me if I'd done my homework, or when she told me I had to be in bed by 10 o'clock, or when I was told to eat all my cabbage, or I wouldn't get dessert. Now I could leave all my food and just eat dessert, and my parents wouldn't even bat an eyelid. All the boundaries that had been placed around my life, that I'd always despised, had been lifted. My parents didn't care any more about anything now that Julia was in a coma. It was as if the safety and security of our home had come crashing down. I craved those parental boundaries more than ever. I longed for my mother to tell me to eat the food on my plate. I longed for her to relegate me to my bedroom for a couple of hours to complete my homework. Those things would have made me feel loved and noticed, for I began to feel lonely and isolated in my home, with parents who were never present and were as inspiring as the white paint on the exterior walls of our home. I reluctantly climbed on my bike and cycled down the long ribbon of asphalt to the wood grove that was situated on the edge of an old logging road. It wasn't too far from our home. I loved it there. It was early spring, spectacularly beautiful, as the dogwood trees were in blossom, their boughs covered in delicate spring blooms, along with the serviceberries, eastern budwoods and tulip trees. Soft shafts of twinkling sunlight cascaded through the branches of the trees, dappling the forest floor in a shimmering ethereal light. I placed my bicycle against a red maple tree, venturing into the heart of the woods, where the voluptuous trunks of the trees penciled up into the sky like statuesque verdant giants, their vast boughs creating a fabulous canopy over my head. My cushioned rubber soles pressed the soft earthen floor beneath my feet, where pretty lacy ferns were scattered liberally across the floor, and green moss carpeted fallen tree branches. Yellow daffodils and bluebells gathered together in cheerful little clusters. A little red fox with a full bushy tail stopped for a second to watch me, and then it scampered off, while a couple of squirrels eyed me curiously through inquisitive brown eyes before they scuttled up the branches. I could hear the pretty sounds of the birds, the warbles, tweets and chirrups, as well as the crashing sound of the white water thundering over the rocks in the pretty stream that meandered through the woods. I happened to look up in the branches of a Herculean-sized tree, which had the most superb solid structure, where at one time an old dilapidated tree-house had stood. No one knew who had built the tree-house, as it had been there for a very long time, but over the years it had fallen apart, although the structure and base were still pretty solid. I was surprised to see that someone had put it together again in a haphazard way that wasn't aesthetically pleasing, but somehow it worked. They had weaved branches, grasses and saplings into the structure. It was very crude and rudimentary, but I was curious and assumed some kids had created this little hideout. Naturally, I was intrigued, so I climbed up the tree to examine it closely and to investigate the structure better. I was pleased with what I found. It really was quite cosy up there. It smelt a little musty, but that didn't put me off in any way. The original treehouse floor was still in place, and there was a wide door-like opening that overlooked the stream, and the view over the water was absolutely magnificent. I sat down to enjoy the panoramic view and decided to eat my sandwiches up in this sheltered space. I opened up my plastic container and pulled out a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and took a bite. It tasted delicious, as everything eaten outdoors invariably does. I also took a big swig of orange juice from my thermos flask. It was peaceful up in the treehouse. I could see long ribbons of moving water cascading over the rocks, which was so hypnotic that I found myself shutting my eyes for a moment and beginning to drift off to sleep. How long I was out for I don't know, but I was lying on the treehouse floor in a curled heap. All of a sudden I woke up to hear a creaking sound. Someone was climbing up the tree. I began to panic as a hefty silhouette manoeuvred itself up the tree trunk until it was hovering over me. Then I saw it. Nothing prepared me for what I was witnessing. It was a surprise to see me, as I was to see it. This thing was a monster. There is no other way to describe it. It was quite literally the most terrifying creature I have ever beheld. A creature that belongs to the realms of fairy tales or gruesome legends, but not in our reality. I was so startled by what I was seeing that I rubbed my eyes a couple of times to ensure I wasn't dreaming. But this was no dream. This was my worst nightmare come to fruition. The creature looked human, in its body shape and silhouette, but it possessed the muzzle, tail and claws of a dog, but it stood on 2 feet like a man. I sat up from my sleeping position with eyes as wide as saucers and a mouth hanging open with astonishment. I could feel my entire body trembling. The creature glared at me with treacherous red eyes that depicted such a malevolent hatred towards me. I realized that this little treehouse was its den, and he wasn't happy with me for making myself at home in his nest. I watched in horror as it lifted back its thin black lips to reveal those sharp, ghastly canine teeth, while it let out the most terrifying roar. I began to scream. I literally bolted down the wrong side of the tree to escape its grasp. But this hideous, repugnant thing was after me. I could hear its heavy breathing, grunting, and occasional snarl. I knew I was in trouble. Big, big trouble. My heart was thundering violently in my chest while my life flashed before my eyes. I was certain I was about to die. I lost my footing, stumbling down the tree. I fell with an almighty thud. I landed on the ground at an unfortunate angle. I could feel my ankle throbbing as waves of pain shot through my foot. I tried to get up, stumbling on all fours, raising myself to my feet. I began to hobble awkwardly. The pain was excruciating. There was no way I could get away from this beast. All of a sudden, large clawed hands grabbed me by the arm, throwing me to the ground with a powerful force. The creature pounced on top of me, crushing my body beneath his weight. I could hear his heart beating against my body, smell his vile, hot breath. It smelt like rotten meat. He blew hot air on my neck. I was terrified. I shut my eyes as tightly as I could. I did try to fight back, wiggling my body beneath his, but he held me down with such a powerful brute force that I couldn't even move a muscle. The next thing I knew was this creature was licking my neck with his huge, hot, wet tongue. It was drooling over me as its spittle began dribbling all over my face. Then something quite extraordinary happened. A thunderous booming sound could be heard bounding through the forest. It sounded like hundreds of bison were running towards us, kicking up the ground with their hooves as the forest seemed to heave and groan. It was unlike any sound I've ever heard before. The sound came to a sudden stop, and then I heard the most frightful roar. The creature that had been crushing me under his weight jumped to his feet. He reacted adversely to that roar. I opened my eyes to see fear in his eyes. He let out a strange, anguished cry. He began to hightail it out of the forest as fast as he could, clearly rattled by what was approaching us. And that was when I saw it. Standing in between 2 red maple trees, looking directly at me, through deep-set dark eyes, was a Bigfoot. I should have been terrified, but the Bigfoot's eyes were so incredibly kind, as it regarded me with such a sincere, genuine look, as though it was worried about my welfare. It seemed protective towards me. At the time I didn't know what it was, but it stood up on 2 legs at about 8 foot tall and 3 foot wide across the shoulder area. It was covered in long flowing golden brown hair, with overlong arms and a pyramid-shaped head, and a face that was so remarkably human. It gestured for me to get up, and escorted me through the forest, walking about 3 feet behind me all the time. I kept hearing it saying in my mind, "I've got your back. You're going to be all right." I was hobbling badly, but gradually my ankle seemed to improve. Luckily it wasn't badly sprained, nor was it broken. I found my bicycle, and the creature continued to follow me until I turned down the driveway that led to my own home, and then he glided away and was gone from my sight. I never saw him again, but I know that Bigfoot saved me from a very dangerous predator that I knew was about to kill me. Of that I am in no doubt. To cut a long story short, my sister came out of a coma after 3 months. Her memory came flooding back shortly afterwards. Me and my sister both compared notes, and are absolutely convinced that the dog-like creature that chased after her that day was the same one that tried to attack me in the woods when I took refuge in its nest. We never shared our stories with our parents to avoid upsetting them further. It would seem that both of my parents didn't fare well from my sister's drawn-out coma, but finally, after a little counselling, they bounced back. They became the loving parents we once knew. I was so grateful now for the boundaries and rules. It meant my parents were paying attention to me again. My sister made a full recovery from her accident and was given a golden retriever from our neighbour as a gift. We called her Chancer, as my sister said she'd been given a second chance at life. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, some people are born evil, through no fault of their parents, nor their upbringing. They're born that way. Mrs. Colleen Talesford was fully aware that her 8-year-old son Justin was not like the other children in her quaint little Tennessee home in the Smoky Mountains, where the family lived in an old cabin that had been built by her great-grandfather. And despite all the wear and tear of raising a big family, the cabin had stood the test of time. It had been superbly built. She was fortunate that the cabin was sizable, with a large main room and a central fireplace, a kitchen and 3 bedrooms, where the children slept in cosy bunk beds. From the moment Justin had emerged from the womb, after being delivered by the doctor in exchange for 4 very fat chickens, she had smelt trouble, as he had screamed continuously, demanding her undivided attention. Now he was an 8-year-old boy. He was continuously giving her grief, getting into all kinds of trouble, was a burr under the saddle. Before her son was born, Colleen Talesford believed that any man that ended up behind prison bars was put there because of a dysfunctional, problematic childhood and bad parenting. Now she knew differently. Sometimes you can conceive a devil child. It can happen to the very best of us, through no choice of our own. Of course she didn't want to believe this to be the truth, but she had kept a wary eye on her son. There were times she was a fortuitous eyewitness to his evil, iniquitous, depraved propensities. On one such occasion she'd been glancing out of the window at home, washing the dishes in the sink, feeling the pleasing suds of hot water that she had boiled on the hob on her hands, as she washed away the grease of the dishes from lunch, with a warm sponge, placing them on a wire rack to dry. She had smiled contentedly to herself as she'd glanced out of the window to see her cute little daughter Claudette with her blonde little pigtails and bright sparkling blue eyes, who was 9 years old, energetically climbing the old oak tree, a few feet away from the kitchen. She had watched Justin climb up to the upper branch with an impressive nimble dexterity to join his sister. They were both giggling happily on top of the branch. And then she saw her son furtively looking around with a clandestine covetousness to see if anyone was watching him. Feeling assured that there were no eyewitnesses, he had sneakily pushed Claudette off the tree, giving her a huge acrimonious shove. He had laughed out loud vindictively as his little sister had come tumbling to the ground below, where she fortunately landed on the soft turf, letting out a painful, anguished cry. Colleen ran into the yard. Her daughter was howling from the pain, and by some miracle she'd only just grazed her knee. "What on earth happened, sweetheart?" asked Mrs. Talesford, knowing full well what had occurred. But she wanted to test her son's honesty, which she rightly assumed was going to be very lacking. "Mummy, Justin pushed me off the tree," Claudette cried. "She's lying, Mum," smirked Justin. "She just fell. She lost her balance. She collided on the ground. That's what happened." Colleen grabbed Justin, shaking him hard. "Don't you lie to me, Justin. I saw what you did. You pushed your sister out of the tree. How could you? You could have killed her. Go to your room right now," she ordered. "I'm very disappointed in you, young man." She had watched Justin smirk at her, wearing a huge grin on his face, for it would seem no amount of discipline had any effect on him at all. On the contrary, the more she tried to reprimand her son, the more objectionable, retaliatory and rebellious he became. No one knew the secret thoughts that were floating through Colleen's mind that she felt ashamed of claiming ownership to. But she did privately regret the very day that Justin was born, for although she loved him very much indeed, she didn't like him at all. Like many Tennessee mountain families, the Tailfords didn't have much money. The family was large. Colleen had over 8 children, Justin being the youngest and the most obnoxious. The little boy had cost her many a sleepless night. She had talked to the early hours of the morning about what could be done to subdue her son's tendencies to cause such contemptuous trouble wherever he went. "I can't believe I'm telling you this, sweetheart," she said to her husband, wiping the tears away from her sorrowful eyes that were heavy with regret. "But I can picture Justin locked up in a prison one day for killing a man." "You really believe our son is capable of such an atrocious, pestiferous evil?" he had asked her, his face looking very grave. "Yes, I do," Colleen had said. "I really, really do." She had stared up at the timber ceiling vacantly, wishing with all her heart that she didn't feel this way. But deep in her gut she knew she was right. None of her children liked their little brother. They also kept a wary distance from him, as even though no words were articulated, everyone knew what he was capable of. "I'm sorry to have to say this, sweetheart, but our son is a bad egg." It was 1952. Colleen contacted Pastor Greg Jameson. She was at the end of her tether about what to do about Justin. He had cold-heartedly wrung the necks of over 20 chickens in her yard that were an intrinsic, vital and important part of the family's livelihood. But Justin had enjoyed just killing the chickens. She had seen the callous glee on his amused face after he'd massacred them, all with blood on his hands, feathers everywhere, and frantic chickens running around the yard, while her other children, who loved the chickens very much, were terribly upset. "Mum, Justin's wringing the necks of the chickens," they'd cried, tears pouring down their faces. "He killed my favourite chicken, Mummy. He killed Princess and little Gemma." 2 chickens that the family would never have eaten in a million years. In the end, they had buried their 2 favourite chickens in the yard, had a funeral ceremony for them, because those chickens were beloved family pets. "How could you do this?" asked Colleen, looking at her son in disgusted revulsion, as he began throwing up the dead chicken heads in the air, as some kind of insidious vitriolic juggling act. "You do realise what you've done, young man?" Colleen had scolded. "Do you not understand that these precious chickens of ours help provide our family with eggs? Look what you've done, killed them. What on earth is wrong with you? Now go to your room at once. I'll get your father to deal with you later." When her husband had returned home, he'd hit his son on the backside with a leather belt, which was something he despised having to do, but there had to be some way of disciplining the out-of-control young man. "What am I to do with my son, Pastor Greg?" Colleen had asked him. "Justin is not a good boy. I'm frightened by what he's becoming. He's constantly picking fights with my children, pulling their hair, pushing them over so that they fall and hurt themselves. Now he's being cruel to animals. What do I do about this?" "I tell you what, Colleen, why don't you let Justin move in with me for a month? I'll teach him the good ways of our Lord." "You would do that?" Colleen Talesford had asked. "Oh, Pastor, I can't thank you enough." But it would seem a month later, when her son returned back to her little mountain cabin, he was as foul, stony-hearted, unruly and as spiteful as ever. Colleen began to realise there was nothing she could do to change her son into the gracious young man she was hoping he would one day become. All her other 7 children were the most polite, respectable, loving members of the community. But Justin was the black sheep of the family. Colleen wanted to love him as much as her other children, but try as she might, she could not. In truth, she struggled to even like her son. She was an awesome mother with a nurturing spirit that many would describe today as a domestic goddess. She baked bread every day, sewed all her children's clothes, managed the affairs on their little plot of land, seamlessly growing, canning and storing vegetables in the family pantry. They lived in a beautiful mountain cabin on the edge of a gravel road, surrounded by undulating mountainous valleys and hundreds of trees, namely American beech, yellow birch, sugar maple, buckeye and wild cherry. Mrs. Talesford had taken her son to visit inmates at a prison, having got special permission from the sheriff. She had accompanied her son to the prison, sat there with him when a man called Jerry had come to speak with her son. Mrs. Talesford had seen him for the first time. She nearly had a heart attack. She described him as one of the most intimidating, scary men she'd ever had the pleasure to meet. He was a big, burly, powerful man, whom looked as if he could lift up a car without even breaking a sweat. He had strapping biceps on him that were so large she doubted he would even be able to wear a traditional suit without bursting the sleeves. His skin was heavily inked like a sailor. Most of the tattoos on the man were pictures he possibly regretted, like skull and crossbones, along with satanic-looking symbols that made Mrs. Talesford shudder. Yet according to the prison officers, this man had turned his life around quite dramatically, was now a model prisoner who preached the gospel to his fellow inmates and was advocating love, not hate. Mrs. Talesford could see this was true. The prisoner had such compassion in his steely blue eyes as he eyed Justin. Jerry looked at Justin and said to him, "You remind me of myself when I was a young boy. I behaved exactly like you, killing chickens, harming animals, hurting my siblings, stealing and getting caught up into all kinds of drunken brawls and altercations. You don't want to become like me. Look at me, son. This is my whole life locked away in a prison cell because I did a very stupid thing. I robbed a gas station, killed a man. Do you know what it's like to live with that on your conscience? My selfish actions destroyed a young family's life. Yet, by the grace of God, that incredible family has forgiven me. I was very fortunate about that. Suffice to say, I robbed 3 children of their father, a woman of her loving husband. Never once did I stop to think of the ramifications of what I had done, the hurt I caused, the hearts I broke." "What did it feel like to kill a man?" Justin asked, his face growing animated. "It didn't feel good, son. Not at all." "But you didn't know the man. Why would you even care?" "Because life is precious, Justin. All life is precious. The good book preaches that we are made in the image of God." "How did you kill the man at the gas station?" Justin asked. "With a trigger. It was over very quickly, but his terrified face still haunts me today." He continued, "You don't want to end up like me, stuck behind bars for the rest of your life. This is no way for a man to live. I will die in this prison, never ever see the light of day. Others like me have ended up paying with their lives. But either way, young man, when I leave this prison, it will be in a box." "What do you have to say, Justin?" Mrs. Talesford had said to her son. Justin had stared at Jerry and said, "Why did you get caught?" Jerry had looked at Justin intently, smiled a knowing smile. "Is that what you think, young man? That I shouldn't have been foolish enough to get caught? That's what a lot of people think. That's how I used to think. I thought I was far too clever for the law, that I would never ever get caught. Let me tell you something, Justin. However clever you may think you are at getting away with stuff, you're never as crafty as you think you actually are. Sooner or later, you will invariably get caught." "Jack the Ripper never got caught," piped Justin. "In 1888, he murdered 5 prostitutes in Whitechapel in the district of London East End, and he was never identified or ever arrested. He was too clever to get caught." "I wouldn't say that," said Jerry. "I don't agree. I think if he had continued his killing spree, he would have got caught sooner or later. But that is not the point, son. It's not about what you can get away with. It's not that matters. It's about living right, about honouring your father and mother, living in peace and in love with others." "Right," said Justin. Mrs. Talesford had sighed. She knew that her son had not been moved in any way by their visit to the prison. She had been visibly shocked by how her son had talked about Jack the Ripper with such a reverent awe, putting the man on a pedestal. It made her ponder as to what kind of a monster her son might one day become. Claudette's account. "I didn't trust my brother an inch. Justin was my brother, but I didn't like him at all. He was evil to the core. I'd seen him do things that were so distressing. On one occasion he found about 8 little kittens and tossed them in a bag, throwing them in the lake to drown them. He laughed because he thought it was so funny. But I dived into the lake. I rescued all those kittens. I never told him about it, but I knew that if he found out what I'd done, he wouldn't be pleased. The poor kittens were terrified. I took them to the lady up the road from us, who homes abandoned kittens. She found good homes for the little sweethearts. I wanted to keep one for myself, but I daren't because I knew that Justin couldn't be trusted with animals. He took great pleasure in hurting innocent creatures. I had seen the merciless way he killed bugs, frogs, snakes and mice, using a carved knife. He hammered them to death until the animals were completely pulverized, as if they'd been thrown into a blender. He seemed to get a thrill out of harming innocent things. He had a macabre fascination for killing things, as if the act of killing itself brought him a measure of satisfaction. Growing up, we always included Justin in our games. We had to, but we watched him warily, because we could never trust him 100%. One day, several of us kids were playing hide-and-seek in the woods together. Justin was included in our game as usual. I'd taken it upon myself to hide in the little shack on the edge of the woods that I think had been used for storing firewood in the 1930s. It overlooked a stream that ran through the valley with a feisty current. The noise of the water could be deafening there. I scrambled into the little place, hiding behind a large barrel in the room, thinking that I'd found the quintessential perfect hiding spot. I was coughing and spluttering a lot. The place was covered in dust. There was a couple of tiny windows covered in dust and cobwebs. I could hear someone fiddling with the lock. I ran from behind the barrel to see Justin. He grinned at me. "Hi, sis. I've locked you inside. Have fun." I slammed at the door. "Please, Justin, this isn't funny. Let me out now. Let me out." I began to sob as I saw Justin walking away. I knew my brother well enough to know that I could be locked in this place for days on end, as Justin would lie with a straight face to my parents, and they would believe his lies. I knew what he was capable of doing. Leaving me here for days would be something he was inclined to do. I shouted loudly, but no one heard my frantic calls. They were drowned out by the loud noise of the water. I sat there on the floor, absolutely terrified about the prospect of not being found. I could be stuck in this shack for days, and even if I broke the tiny windows, I wouldn't be able to squeeze out of them. They were far too tiny. I could hear my friends calling me, along with Justin. Of course he was calling out my name as well. They began to shout my name loud, but no one heard my cries, as once again the sound of the water drowned out my voice. How long I sat there in the shack I do not know. I lost all concept of time. I drew pictures on the earthen floor to entertain myself. I remember what my mother had said about what I should do if I was ever afraid. "Always remember to pray," she told me. So I prayed, "Please God, will you send an angel to open up the door for me?" I felt better after I prayed, but I could see that the day was fading. I could hear my parents and other people from our town calling out my name. Everyone was looking for me. Of course I tried to shout back, but no one heard my voice. Before long it got very dark outside, as no one was looking for me any more. Why had they not thought to look for me in the shack, I wondered. Perhaps it was easy to overlook. On reflection, it wasn't the cleverest place for me to hide in. It was so dark in the shack. Beyond the cobwebs in the windows, I could see that it was so black out there. I felt scared because ghosts came out at night. I'd heard lots of ghost stories around the Smoky Mountains from many people in these parts, for they had experienced anomalous encounters here. I remembered my grandfather's story that he told us last Thanksgiving around a warm fire. I'd sat on his lap. He had put his arms around me lovingly. We'd begged him to tell us a ghost story, because when you're sitting around a cosy fire listening to your grandfather tell you a ghost story, it's not so scary then. Not in that environment anyway. "Gramps, do you think ghosts are real?" we'd asked, and he'd stroked his white beard reflectively, and he'd said, "I've no doubt they're real. I've seen one myself. It was 1930. I was driving my boss's Buick, Series 40. I was performing an errand for him. I saw a young woman walking on the side of the road. I asked if I might give her a lift. She was wearing a pale green midi-length bias-cut dress with puff sleeves and a white belt. She was wearing her shoulder-length blonde hair in the romantic wave style that was very popular at the time. I was puzzled to see her walking on a remote country road, and didn't like to think of a woman walking on her own like that in the late afternoon, when the day was gradually drawing to a close. She gratefully stepped into the car, sank back into the passenger seat beside me. I asked her where she wanted to go. She told me her name was Lola Pike, gave me the address. I took her to the place which turned out to be her home. She thanked me very much for the lift, got out of the car, and that was the last I saw of her. I never thought anything about it until I heard about a woman by the very same name who had been killed by lightning on a Tuesday evening on the very same stretch of road where I had picked up the woman of the same name on the Thursday. So I went to see her family. They showed me a picture of their deceased loved one. I realized I'd picked her up. I must have picked up her ghost. She had died on a Tuesday. I had picked her up on a Thursday. As I sat there thinking about my Gramps' incredible story, I began to shiver nervously. It was scary being on my own, so dark inside the shack. I could barely see my own hand before my face. After a long while I became drowsy, as the lids of my eyes became heavy. My body became floppy like a rag doll. So I began to fall asleep. But I was awoken to the sound of someone coughing outside the shack. I felt so deliriously happy. Obviously my family hadn't given up looking for me after all, because there was somebody outside, and whoever was out there, they were near enough to hear me shout. So I began to bang at the door, calling for help. "Help me! Help me! I'm here! Help! Help!" The next thing I knew was that someone appeared to be grunting outside the door. I could hear them speaking together in a strange language that I didn't know, and I wasn't familiar with. The next thing I knew was that the door was broken down. It came flying off its hinges. Imagine my surprise when I realized that the person who'd broken down the door was an 8-foot creature covered in long flowing dark hair that I now know to be a Bigfoot. Back then I had no idea what this thing was. I could tell it was a she, but she was standing there with a male creature. I was struck by how enormous they both were. They were like human beings wearing big bear costumes on their bodies, and they were very kind and gentle towards me. It was a velvety night with a bright scattering of silvery stars that twinkled like diamonds and a rather obscure moon, so I didn't get to see the creature's features very clearly, but they seemed to know exactly where I lived and who I was. The female creature picked me up in her arms as if I was a baby, carried me directly home. She glided so smoothly across the ground with me, without even bumping once. I was never afraid of the creatures for a fleeting second. I knew I was absolutely safe in their charge. As far as I was concerned, they were the bear angels that God had sent in answer to my prayers. The two creatures waited in the tree line to ensure I got into the house safely. My parents had not been able to sleep, as they had called out search parties for me, but no one knew where I was. My mother took me into her arms when she opened the door. She was trembling, the tears pouring down her face. She thought something quite terrible had happened to me. She said my little face was covered in dirt. I had dust all over my little dress. "Where did you get to, Claudette? We were looking for you everywhere. What happened?" I told them that Justin had locked me in the shack near the stream, and that I had heard their calls, but had been unable to answer them, as the sound of the stream had drowned out my voice. "But how did you get out of the shack?" my mother asked me. I told her that I did what she told me to do when I was scared. I had prayed to God, and God had sent 2 bear angels to rescue me from the shack. My parents were incensed with Justin. "What did you lock your sister in the shack for?" they asked him. "It was only a bit of fun," he smirked. "Only a bit of fun," my father shouted. "What are you smoking, son? Half the town gave up their free time to look for your sister tonight, and all the time you knew exactly where she was. How could you do this to us? We were overwrought with worry." "Like I said, it was only a bit of fun. She's fine, isn't she?" "That's not the point, Justin. Stop smirking. Go to your room right now. I'm ashamed to call you my son." One day when Justin was 13 years old, he and his best friend Marcus, who was also a hooligan, broke into an old lady's house by climbing through the back window. Her name was May Ferris. They'd falsely assumed that this formidable old lady would be a pushover. How wrong they were. She'd been drinking moonshine with one of the neighbours, and Justin and his friend Marcus thought she would be so inebriated, intoxicated and wasted that when they broke into her house, she would be far too stoned to even realise she was being robbed, or remember anything about it the following morning. It was rumoured that she had a sizable amount of cash that she kept on her property, although whether the rumours were true is open to speculation. May Ferris was an indestructible red-blooded mountain lady, through and through, and tough as old nails. She had woken up in the middle of the night as she lay fast asleep in her bed to a draught in her bedroom, while 2 young boys were going through her stuff in her home with a fine tooth comb. In a trice she realised what was going on, switching on her kerosene light. "I might have known it would be you, Justin," she said. "Everyone in town knows your trouble." "Don't move," she screamed, "or I will blow your heads off." The 2 boys were absolutely terrified as the woman was slurring her words, waving her rifle around precariously. They were terrified it would just go off. "You boys come with me now," she said, taking 2 large ropes with her. "I'm going to teach you both a lesson that you will never forget." The woman was resolute and determined, the boys fearful. "Please don't hurt us," Justin begged. "Please, May, we're sorry about breaking into your home." "That's not good enough. I want you to be really sorry." She instructed both boys to walk forwards into the woods while she walked behind them with her rifle. Justin had tried to escape, but May had fired a couple of random shots behind him. He decided that the woman was so mad that they better just obey her commands. When they entered the woods, May threw a rope at Marcus, commanding him to tie his friend to the tree. "Don't try any clever stunts with me, or any clever loopholes in that rope. If he can escape, I'll blow your head off," she warned him. Marcus was forced to tie his friend to the tree as tightly as he possibly could, so that Justin would never be able to escape the tight hold of the rope. Justin became very alarmed when May left him alone in the woods, as he was secretly very afraid of the dark. She took Marcus back to her home with her, locking him up in the chicken coop, and then she retired back to her bed. That night, Justin was absolutely petrified, being tied to a tree in the middle of the woods. His friend Marcus had done a phenomenal job in tying him up. There was no way he could wiggle free from the powerful stranglehold of the rope around his body. He soon realised that he and Marcus had underestimated this ghastly, obnoxious woman, May Ferris. She was completely unhinged and as nutty as a fruitcake. He had more than likely met his female match. Ostensibly that night he got to experience what it was like to be helpless, vulnerable, insecure, left in the gloomy, oppressive darkness in the middle of the woods, at the mercy of any wild animals that could be loitering around. Never in his entire life had he felt that level of fear, trepidation and impending dread as he did now. The dark night was gloomy, unfriendly, hostile, absent of light, devoid of the reassuring sounds of frogs and crickets that might have brought him a small measure of comfort. Did this mean a predator was skulking around in the dark shadows? More than likely. Justin shuddered, his heart pounding violently in his chest, his guts twinging with a nausea he could taste in the back of his throat that was as bitter as gall. The trees in the woodgrove swayed dangerously in the wind, their boughs swaggering like ghostly arms that were desirous to grab you. He could occasionally see eyes looking in his direction. Menacing, threatening, pretentious yellow and red eyeshine. It could be anything, he thought. A mountain lion, a coyote, a fox, a cougar. His fears escalated as he thought about the potential danger he could be in. Why did it have to be so dark in the woods? Why did every tree look like a monstrous beast? Why did the woods, that was such a welcoming place in the day, become so guileful and treacherously unaccommodating at night? He would rather be anywhere else in the world than here. He closed his eyes tightly, praying for the first time in his life, like he'd never prayed before. Father, he said, please send an angel like you did for Claudette when I locked her in the shack. I know I deserve what is happening to me. I'm not a good person, but I promise you I'll change if you send me some help. He waited for a while, closing his eyes tightly, but no answer came to his prayers. No one came to his rescue. He wasn't surprised. Why should God send him an angel? All his life he'd done bad things. God only sent angels to help good people like Claudette, and good he certainly was not. He reflected about all the bad things he'd done, the hurt he'd caused his family, the insufferable grief of his mother, who had tried everything to help her son change his hardened heart. But he had been like Scrooge in the Christmas Carol, unrelenting in his determination to cause chaos and discord wherever he went. His loving, devoted, ever-faithful mother had even taken him to a prison to meet a prisoner called Jerry, who had killed a man. Jerry had tried to get through to him, to explain that doing bad things was no walk in the park. There were always consequences to bad choices, and being tied up in the woods as he was now was a consequence to a very bad choice. If he hadn't broken into May Ferris's house, he wouldn't be tied here to a tree in the middle of the woods now, would he? I'm sorry for everything, he cried, the tears pouring down his face. I promise I'll change. Please send me help. Please, I beg you. From a little way away he heard the thumping of feet moving across the forest floor. It was the most terrifying sound that made the hair stand up on the back of his neck. Whomever was coming his way sounded hefty, substantial, very large. Then he saw it moving through the trees. It really was the most petrifying thing he'd ever seen, based on the density of its monstrous silhouette. For against the dark shadows he saw a cone-shaped head, huge Goliath-sized shoulders, a gargantuan torso, tree-trunk-sized legs, and this thing, whatever in God's name it was moving towards him. He closed his eyes as tightly as he could, hoping that this thing would go away. He could hear it breathing on him. It sounded like a horse. Slowly and surely he opened his eyes to see that he was staring into the eyes of a human-like creature. He was surprised to see that the eyes were full of humour. He realised in that instant that this must be the bear angel that had saved his sister one time. Had it also come to save him, he wondered. He pointed to the rope. The creature tugged it with one hand. It snapped in half instantly. Justin looked at the creature. He said thank you. It seemed to nod at him, and then he watched it glide away. To cut a long story short, growing up, me and Justin believed that the bear angels, which we now know are Bigfoots, had been sent to us by God. Something happened to Justin after that encounter that transformed his heart from a heart of stone to a heart of flesh. Even my parents could not comprehend what had happened to him. In the 1980s, Justin flew to Africa, where today he is heavily involved in rhino conservation. So maybe a bad egg can change into a good one after all. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I watched my Gramps rubbing his magnificent full white beard, wiping the beads of perspiration that had gathered on his forehead. A nervous result, he informed us, of remembering the story he was about to tell us, that over the years had made him break out in hives whenever he recalled the direful events of that horrifying night when he was a mere boy of 12 years old. He smiled at us through his arctic blue eyes that were so piercing that you could be forgiven for thinking he was looking right through you. At times it almost felt as if he actually was. I could tell he had an arresting, riveting and gripping story to tell us, but he was biding his time, as all stories need to be told in the perfect idyllic setting. But could an ambient contexture be more perfect than this one? I didn't think so. My name is Wallace, by the way,
although some people call me Wally. Me and my sister Paula were seated outside on the ground on soft cushions around a roaring fire pit, while my Gramps was sitting on an old tree stump that he was using as a makeshift stool. I've always preferred sitting on the ground rather than on a rickety camping chair. And I'm sorry, but in my opinion, I don't care how good your camping chair actually is. Most of them are pretty unstable. I like to be able to tug the grass with my hands, feel close to the earthen floor, even smell the faint sweet scent of the grass. On a chair you miss out on all that. It's like the difference between eating with your hands or with a knife and fork. The taste of a metal fork can rob the natural flavours of the food. It's the same thing, really. It was a velvety black night, the sky so awe-inspiring, so beautiful, so black. Not if you were venturing out on your own, of course, would this night be beautiful, but for a gripping story, the night was hauntingly provocative. There was a scattering of bright silvery stars sparkling in the sky, a white glowing half-crescent moon that bespeckled the night, with just enough light to leave your imagination running wild in an excited frenzy, creating scary, suggestive, ghost-like beings in your head that you could envisage creeping through the dark shadows, staring at you through insidiously hollow eyes from between the trees. I loved being scared stiff, but I wanted to be scared out of my mind in a safe place where the excited tingles of my fear would leave me titillated, galvanized into an intoxicating, excited stupor. Beyond the backyard of my grandfather's rustic timber cabin, that was as quaint as it was whimsical, the ominous towering silhouettes of the tall Douglas fir trees moved against a still breeze. They looked like clusters of tall, menacing giants, gathered together under the full moon. They seemed to whisper to each other as their needled boughs swayed backwards and forwards in the wind. My grandfather stoked the fire pit. The flames hissed in response. They grew higher. The fire crackled, red, orange, yellow. It burnt brightly. We watched as the timber beams buckled, folded, curled and spitted. It was strangely hypnotic. "Well, dear," said my grandmother, "how long are you going to keep us all in suspense, sweetheart? Our grandchildren are itching to hear a good story from you this evening." "A good story," I corrected, "but a true one, Gramps." "I'm not going to tell my story until you've seated yourself down, sweetheart," said my Gramps, eyeing my grandmother warily. "You've got ants in your pants this evening. Why don't you settle down like the rest of us?" "Very well," said my grandmother, pulling up an old tree stump to sit on. "I'm all ears." My grandmother was a woman in her early 80s, but she was as fit as anyone in their 50s, with a back so straight that it would make a pencil look crooked. But while her body was robust, the lines on her wizened face spoke of a life well lived, with creases around her eyes, laugh lines around her cheeks, and deep furrows crinkling her forehead. I watched her smiling as her pale face lit up like a bright light. The lines around her cheeks and her eyes became further accentuated into deep grooves, for she was a woman who laughed a lot. She sat back on the stump as eager to hear my Gramps tell his story, almost as much as we were. I glanced around at our environment, drinking it in like the delicious creamy chocolate of a milkshake in a straw. It didn't get better than this, I thought, as I saw the bright yellow light of my grandparents' wooden cabin twinkling under the dark sky, while I could hear the night filled with an orchestra of crickets, frogs, and in the distance we could hear the occasional yap of a coyote or a howl of a wolf. Was this how cosy and snug it felt in the days of old, I wondered, when the family gathered around a fire to hear a great story, told by one of the family elders? In my opinion, it was so much better than watching a television program, as storytelling engages your senses, leaves you always pondering, what if? All was quiet as eyes focused on my Gramps, as he began to tell us his story. "Well, when I was a young boy of about 12 years old, I begged my father to let me come coon hunting with him. It was in those woods over there," he said, gesturing towards the trees of the vast wood grove that surrounded his property and branched out towards an old logging road. And yet beyond that, there were still more trees, as well as a pretty little creek. "As you well know, I grew up in this cabin on this plot of land, and during the day I spent all my time in the woods. But I've never experienced them at night. The idea intrigued me. I would say perhaps a little more than intrigued. It excited me. I'd never explored those woods at night before. Growing up, we heard all kinds of stories about the woods. People had seen strange orbs glowing through the trees. There had been reports of people having encounters with the Fae. But I took all those stories with a pinch of salt. My father was very annoyed by the growing coon population on our property. He claimed they were pinching the grain from the barn, so he believed the numbers could well do with being managed. At the time, his brother Russell was staying at the cabin with us, so the three of us ambled happily into the woods together, with our two family dogs, Jasper and Giles. The two rambunctious, very lively mixed-breed retriever dogs were incredibly excited, as even before the hunt they were jumping up and down exuberantly on their paws, while thrashing the floor with their tails in eager expectation. The two dogs had been on a plethora of coon hunts before, were heartily consummate and proficient at the hunt, knew what was expected of them. They were skilled in picking up the scent of the coons with their sharp noses, so that we could easily hunt our quarry. So armed with rifles and night lights, we entered the woods. I could see my father wasn't too thrilled that I was coming along for the ride, but he knew that I would be crushed if I wasn't allowed to come. Besides, my mother had persuaded them to take me. "It's good for our son to understand the woods at night," she explained. The woods were indeed very different at night. Everything was so dark beyond our lights. All was dense, thick and black, while shadows moved through the trees. You always sensed you were being watched, even if you weren't. Before long the dogs were on the trail, with their noses pinned to the ground, as they sprung into the woods, whizzing past us. We could hear them way ahead of us, making a raucous commotion. They were jumping up and down a large tree trunk, their heads cocked up to the upper branches. We thought the coons were in that tree. That is what we assumed the dogs were so enthused about. But we looked in the tree branches to see not a coon as we had expected, but a very frightened-looking creature with big, bright brown eyes sitting on a branch. It was tiny, about the size of a little toddler, but it was covered in dark brown hair with overlong arms and a human-looking face. The creature looked scared out of its wits, and it began climbing the tree higher to get away. It was making a whimpering sound, while the two dogs were in a frenzy, barking up at the tree, losing all interest in continuing with the coon hunt. Whatever was up that tree was infinitely more interesting to them than chasing a raccoon. It was clear the dogs were completely fascinated by this arousing new scent, interested in this strange creature. Their excitable barking escalated. I remember my grandfather looking at us and saying, "What the heck is that creature? Did you see how human the face is?" His feverish dogs were still barking deliriously around the tree. You could hear the little distraught whimpers of the tiny thing that was clearly very afraid. It was dangling on one branch with its overlong arm like a orangutan. All of a sudden we heard something prodigious blasting through the woods at one hell of a speed, banging, pounding, booming and slamming the ground so hard under its massive feet. It sounded as if a colossal bulldozer was thundering towards us, or a couple of powerful rhino. Whatever was coming our way was very big. Our two dogs began to whimper, but they hightailed it back to the cabin with their tails between their legs. Those dogs were terrified and had no intention of staying around. They were clever dogs. They could sense and feel danger. My grandpa and his brother were shaking in their boots. You would think we would have run away, but the sound of that thing thumping the forest floor as it headed towards us immobilized us, as if we'd been tasered. We became disorientated and confused. I remember my father began to tremble violently. His eyes grew wide with horror. He cried out, "Something big is coming towards us! We need to get out of here now!" My father's brother looked as white as a ghost, as if all the colour had drained from his skin, while I stood there unable to comprehend what was actually happening. But I humiliated myself immeasurably by discovering that a warm liquid was running down my legs. I had wet myself. It was awfully embarrassing. Despite my father telling us to get the hell out of there, none of us moved a single muscle, or even tried to escape. For some reason we just couldn't. I don't even know exactly why. It was like we were frozen in the fabric of time, like three people in a still photograph. Whatever was moving towards us began shaking the branches of the trees vigorously. We could hear tree limbs cracking, snapping and breaking all around us. That was when we saw her. We realized at once that this was the mother of the creature we'd seen sitting in the tree. She was absolutely enormous, strong, lofty, majestic. She stood up on 2 feet, was easily over 8 foot tall, with the most enormous, rounded, well-developed shoulders that I've ever seen, that were easily 3 feet in width across. She had arms so long that they fell beyond her knees. Her body was so powerfully built like a solid piece of farming machinery, while her legs were stocky, robust like tree trunks. She was covered in long, fine hair. She looked human with some ape-like influences to her appearance. For a moment we stared at her in a stupefied, wondrous awe, while she stared back at us. Her deep-set dark eyes glittered with a red eye-shine. She appeared worried, as her discerning, intelligent eyes hovered over my Gramps and his brother's rifles. It was clear she knew what they were. She wasn't at all happy. She was possibly afraid that we might use them on her, when that was the last thing on our minds. All any of us were thinking about was getting the hell out of there as quickly as we could, hopefully still in one piece. The creature let out a huge, ear-piercing roar that was so terrifying it jolted us out of our senses. "Run!" my father shouted. "Run as fast as you can!" For some unexplainable reason, both men dropped their rifles to the ground. Their hands became limp, and their rifles just fell out of their hands. Something they've never been able to explain or comprehend. It was an involuntary action. They began to run with me following behind them. The creature began to chase us, but she was so fast, I'm in no doubt she could have easily caught up with us if she'd really wanted to. I think she wanted to scare us off. She fully succeeded in her endeavours. I just remember being so terrified, my heart was pounding violently in my ears, and the adrenaline was pumping in my blood so fast that I even overtook my father in the race back to the cabin. When we got to the cabin, the dogs were cowering outside the door, begging to be let inside. My father thrust the door open wide. We bolted into the cabin, locking doors and windows behind us in an alarmed frenzy, and then collapsing on the sofa in an exhausted heap, struggling to find our breaths. My father was trembling and saying that there was a monster out there, that we had to remain in the house, as this creature could potentially kill us. My mother, who'd been sleeping, was very annoyed to be woken up by 2 grown men that were in such a dreadful state. She firmly told everyone to calm down and to stop overreacting. She wanted to know what all the fuss was about, but the men were panicking so much she couldn't get a word out of them. I told her that we'd seen a very big hairy lady in the woods. We could see the silhouette of the creature walking around our cabin. She was roaring indignantly, tapping our windows with her hands. She sounded incredibly upset. Everything in the cabin began to shake and quiver under that terrifying sound. My mother's crystal glasses on the dresser in the living room began to wobble precariously, while my father and his brother continued to tremble with fear. We could see the creature pressing her face against the window, looking inside at us with furious eyes. Finally, everything went quiet, as the creature decided to return to the woods. In those days we didn't know what we had seen, but nowadays we know the creature was a Bigfoot. My mother made everyone some brandy to calm them down. Everything became silent. The sounds of frogs and crickets then resumed. The following morning it was a beautiful sunny day. I think my father and his brother felt a little silly about their behaviour the previous night, as the cold light of day puts everything into perspective. However, when they walked around the cabin, they saw huge footprints in the mud that were easily over 18 inches long, only expressing how big this creature must have been. My mother was preparing blueberry pancakes for breakfast the following morning. She asked us why we'd been so petrified the previous night, why we'd been terrified out of our skins. She'd heard the creature roaring outside the cabin and tapping on our windows, so she knew we'd encountered something quite substantial. She asked us to tell us exactly what had happened. We told her about the whimpering little creature in the tree, and about the very angry mother. We were surprised when my grandmother took the Bigfoot's side. "Do you realise what you did?" she scolded. "You scared a poor little youngling. It must have been terrified out of its wits, with the dogs yapping around the tree like that, and you all just ogling it. Poor thing. I'm sorry to say, but I have huge sympathy for the creature, and not much for you lot. You handled the situation like bundling idiots. You should have called the dogs off at once, got the hell out of there, shown the creature some respect. Instead, you caused mayhem and disturbed the peace. No wonder the mother came after you to scare you off and warn you not to go upsetting her youngling. I would have reacted exactly the same way if it had been my youngling, she told us. I think we should make amends. We need to reach out to the creature and apologise. I'll make her some cookies. Do you realise we have to live in harmony with nature? We can't go upsetting these things that live around us in the woods. We don't want to create enemies for ourselves. Don't be ridiculous, Isabel, my father said. Have you lost leave of your senses? We can't go befriending wild animals. We don't even know what the strange creature is. And our rifles are in that woodland. I'm reluctant to go and get them after what we experienced last night. You don't even know she could still be out there, waiting to pounce on us at any moment. Oh, don't be so ridiculous, Paul. You do make a mountain out of a molehill about things. You're talking absolute nonsense. If the creature really wanted to hurt you, I dare say she would have done so already. Do you really think that she couldn't outrun you last night? Of course she could. She wanted to give you a jolly good scare. As far as I'm concerned, you all deserved it. You're being completely unreasonable, Isabella. You don't know what this thing was like. It was a monster. Correction, Paul. It was an upset, protective mother. That's what it was. My mother took no notice of her husband and brother. She asked me to help her bake some cinnamon raisin and oat cookies, which I did. I remember we made a huge batch of cookies, and my grandmother asked me to show her where the tree was that we'd seen the youngling, so I went with her into the woods. I remember it felt as if we were being watched, but we looked around and saw nothing there. We looked up the tree where the previous night I'd seen the youngling, but there was no sign of the little creature. But we left the cookies under the tree, in a large Tupperware container. We also looked for the 2 missing rifles, but they were gone, nowhere to be seen. We realised the creature must have moved them. My mother just stood there and said out loud, "Ma'am, I'd just like to apologise on behalf of my husband, his brother, the dogs and my son for upsetting your little youngling last night. I brought you some cookies to express my extreme apologies. We would really like to coexist with you in peace." I remember saying to my mother that there was no way those creatures could hear us, and even if they could, they probably wouldn't understand what we were saying anyway. She said to me stranger things have happened, that I should never underestimate the natural world and its magic. That night my father and his brother retired to bed early, locking all the cabin windows and doors behind them. They had a couple of spare rifles that they kept by the door, in case the creature might come back. Their demeanour changed again the moment that it got dark, as the memory of the previous night came flooding back to them. The dogs also became unduly nervous, so everybody stayed indoors. But that night nothing happened, although at one time during the night the dogs began to bark. My father and his brother were pleasantly surprised that the angry, belligerent mother had not come back. The following morning, when my grandmother got up, we discovered the rifles that belonged to my father had been returned. We found them lying across the step on the front porch, along with a Tupperware container that had been filled with cookies. In its place were 2 big rainbow trout, which my mother cooked for breakfast that morning. They were the most delicious fish I've ever tasted. We knew they were a gift from the creature. We were moved by her generosity, that she'd been so quick to accept our apology. My mother said, "You see, it's about living in harmony with nature. If you respect other living things, they in turn will respect you." Of course, she was absolutely right. We could have made an enemy out of the creature, but in the end we had turned her into a friend. My father was completely mystified that the creature had responded so positively to my mother's gesture of kindness. After that we never had any problems with the Bigfoots in the wood, but very frequently my mother would bake them cookies. They often left us fish in exchange. We never physically saw the Bigfoots again, but we knew they were there, although my mother saw the Bigfoot female on one occasion. It happened after Giles had been diagnosed with cancer by the vet. One day he just disappeared. We imagined he'd gone off somewhere to die, as that is what animals tend to do. We were upset because we would have liked to have buried Giles in our backyard, but he was nowhere to be seen. That was when my mother saw the Bigfoot carrying Giles's dead body towards her. She brought it to the front porch, wrapping the body in a deerskin, covering it with a few green boughs. She said she locked eyes with the Bigfoot for a moment, and that the creature had the most beautiful brown eyes, filled with such compassion. The creature put Giles on the ground and glided away. She said she knew the Bigfoot understood that Giles was a big loss to our family. We were so happy to have his body back, to bury in our yard, which is invariably what we did. "Wow, Gramps," I said. "That's an incredible story. Do you think they're Bigfoot still living in your woodgrove?" "Well, I personally haven't seen any more Bigfoots. The last time I saw one was when I was 12 years old, and that was a long time ago." "That was a wonderful story," I said. We all agreed. At the time we were staying in my Gramps' cabin outside Manitoba in Canada, as my parents, who lived in Toronto, were going through a very ugly divorce at the time. My mother believed it would be better for me and my sister to get out of their hair while they sorted out their differences. While I loved both my parents, I couldn't fathom why two such different people had tied the knot in the first place. I was 12 years old at the time, and I could see that my parents were incongruous in every regard. My sister believed my parents had been initially physically attracted to each other, which was why they got together. I'd seen pictures of my mother as a young woman, and she was quite pretty, so maybe that was true. My father was a quiet man who was self-effacing and never said a single word. He liked to sink into the shadows and disappear, while my mother liked to be the life and soul of the party. My mother began to resent my father's reclusive behaviour. Imagine Tigger in The Wind in the Willows getting together with a very big lazy tortoise. The two are never going to connect. It was like that with my parents. My mother and father were at each other's throats all the time. My mother complaining bitterly that my dad was boring, as he never wanted to paint the town red. My father complaining that my mother was way too social. I even said to my parents, "You both want different things. Why did you ever marry?" They couldn't even answer that question. I had no regrets that my parents were parting ways. On the contrary, I welcomed their decision, as I just wanted to live in harmony, just like my Gramps' mother wanted to live seamlessly with the Bigfoots. I think that's what humans crave, to live in peace. I enjoyed staying with my grandparents, and after my Gramps' amazing story, I was hoping that me and my sister might spot a Bigfoot. The trouble is that I've often found that in life, when you look for something, you don't always find it. Sometimes it comes to you when you least expect it, or in a way you never imagined. It happened to us again, in the form of another Bigfoot story. A very good friend of my grandmother's, a lady called Joyce Malinsky, lived in a cabin not too far away from my grandparents. She popped over to visit one day. She'd known my grandmother for many years. She was a very interesting woman in her early 70s, who dyed her hair a deep auburn colour. She had bright blue eyes, but unlike my grandmother, her back was a little hunched over. She struggled to walk, so she used a walking stick. But despite her physical impediments, she didn't want to settle for a safe, pampered life living in a town. She was surprised to see me and my sister were staying at the cabin, but my grandparents explained that my parents were going through an ugly divorce. "I see," she said, looking at us sympathetically. "Don't be sad," she said. "I know it's difficult when one's parents split up, but sometimes it's for the best." "I'm glad they're splitting up," I told her, "because I'm tired of all their fighting and arguing. I love living in peace. Things will be better if they go their separate ways." "You've got a wise one here," said Joyce, smiling at me brightly. "Have you ever seen a Bigfoot?" I asked her. I don't know why I came up with such a bizarre question, but I did. She looked at me with a startled expression on her face. I knew at once she'd seen a Bigfoot before. "What a strange thing to ask," she said, avoiding my gaze, as if she didn't want to directly answer my question. "It's not really that strange," my grandmother said. "The kids got very excited the other night when Gramps told them about an encounter he had as a young boy with a female Bigfoot, so my grandchildren have been trying to explore the woodgrove for a Bigfoot sighting." "Have you found anything?" asked Joyce. "No," I said, "nothing. But you've seen a Bigfoot, I know you have." "How do you know?" she asked, looking surprised. "Your expression," I told her. "When I asked you if you'd seen one, I could tell by the recognition in your eyes." "It's true, I have seen one," said Joyce. "I regret to have to tell you that the first time I saw a Bigfoot, it was actually dead." "You're joking," I said. "No, I'm not," she said. "It's a very sad story. My husband was out in the woods. He discovered this dead Bigfoot lying on the ground. He touched the body, discovered the creature was still warm. He realized that the strange anomalous creature had died, possibly only moments before. I'm not sure what it had died of, as there were no signs of physical injuries on the creature, or its succumbing to some kind of disease. But I will say this, it looked wasted, as if it was very old. I'm not sure why I would say it looked old, but it did. Its hair was grey. Its skin was exceedingly wrinkled like an elderly person, although it was a very leathery skin, so the furrows were very deep. At the time, he didn't know what it was, nor did I. It was 1984. We'd never heard about Bigfoots before. I remember my husband bolted into the cabin. He said to me, "Joyce, you've got to come and see this. There's a very, very peculiar-looking creature lying dead in the woods. Its body is still warm. I think it's only just died. It looks like a human covered in hair, with some primate-like qualities. I've never seen anything like this before. Are you coming or not?" I must admit I was very beguiled, eager to see what it was my husband had discovered. Over the years living in this part of the world, we've seen unorthodox things before, so I followed him into the woods. My husband warned me to be very quiet, in case there were other creatures like that around. He said this thing was monstrously big, so his kind could be a potential threat. I remember being fascinated when we found the body lying there in the woods on the earthen floor. I picked up the arm. It felt so heavy as it flopped back on the ground. The eyes stared vacantly into space. I remember those eyes were a treacle brown colour. I was very impressed by the size of this thing. Although I believe the creature was very old, it was at the very least 700 pounds and 8 foot tall, with the most humongous shoulders I've ever seen. As we were standing over the dead body, we could hear something coming. Whoever or whatever it was appeared to be whistling. It sounded exactly like a human whistle, but me and my husband instinctively chose to hide, taking cover behind the trees. What we witnessed next was the saddest thing that I've ever seen. A very large creature emerged through the trees. I believe she was also old. That was the impression I got. She looked much like the old man, but was standing upright on 2 feet, was whistling happily. Then she stopped dead in her tracks. Her whistling also stopped, as she saw the dead Bigfoot lying on the ground, motionless. She glided towards the creature with a perplexed expression on her face, and began to shake it vigorously, but obviously it did not respond. My heart melted with such a tender empathy and sadness towards her. I realized she was going through such a deep melancholia, poor thing, for this was her lifelong partner. The creature got onto her haunches, was cradling the dead corpse in her arms, rocking it backwards and forwards like a baby. She whimpered. The whimpering escalated to a howl. I was standing there behind the tree, bawling my eyes out, as this large creature was so devastated. Her heart was completely broken. I could feel her tormented pain. My husband was indicating for us to leave the woods, to leave her alone to grieve in peace. I do remember in the weeks that followed we would hear a wailing sound in the forest for a long time. I said to my husband, "That's the hairy lady. She's grieving the loss of her partner." One day my husband called me again to the woods. We found a huge mound there that looked like a burial plot. It had been marked with sticks. I remember I took flowers to the mound and left them on the grave. I also planted some daffodil bulbs around the grave so that in spring the area was covered in daffodils. It was my way of saying goodbye to the old fellow. Every year on the exact date of the creature's death, I would visit that mound and put flowers on the grave. One year I even put a wreath. The creature died on the 23rd of June, 1984. I never ever forgot that date. It must have been 10 years later in 1994 when my husband was chopping firewood. He told me he was suffering from some heartburn, so I told him to relax and come inside for a coffee. He told me he was feeling a lot better and went out to resume his wood chopping. Then all of a sudden he began to clasp his heart. He stumbled to the ground. I ran over to him and started doing CPR on him, but he'd gone. He died of a heart attack. It was ironic, as only a week before he'd visited the doctor for a general checkup, was given a clean bill of health, so my husband having this unexpected heart attack was a bolt out of the blue. He was an exceedingly healthy man in the prime of life, so why he died so unexpectedly like that was beyond me. Of course the emergency services arrived on the scene, but there was nothing anyone could do. But the extraordinary thing was that the very next day after he died, I opened up my cabin door and found a circular mound of soil had been dug up, surrounded by large stones. Planted in the middle of the circle was a little oak tree. I began to bawl my eyes out as I was moved by this kind gesture. I knew that the Bigfoot was sharing in my grief. She obviously knew what had happened to my husband. I realized that she had created this mound and planted the tree. Over the years she must have seen me visiting the grave, putting flowers on it to remember her loved one. Now in my pain she was doing exactly the same for me. That tree is now a small oak planted outside my cabin. Whenever I look at it, I'm reminded of my husband, and I'm reminded of the Bigfoots. "You never told me this story, Joyce," said my grandmother, bustling around the kitchen to make her some tea. "I suppose I never wanted to tell anyone the story, until now, when your grandson prodded me. I'm glad I did," I said. "That's one of the most beautiful stories I've ever heard." "I had no idea," said my grandmother. "To think that beautiful oak outside your cabin is actually planted by a Bigfoot." "Do you still put flowers on the burial mound?" I asked Joyce. "Not any more. The mound no longer is there. It's because it's part of the landscape now. The land's flattened out. But when I go to the area and I find clusters of daffodils, I know that's the spot where the old Bigfoot was buried." I was told these stories when I was a 12-year-old boy. Sadly, all those people I'm talking about that shared the story with me are long since deceased, but the story still lives on in my heart, and I hope it will live in yours too. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my nonconformist capricious parents always did things exceedingly differently. That was the way they were. So when they bought an abandoned property in the Blue Ridge Mountains in October of 2013, it didn't come as a big surprise to me. They always acted impulsively and did idiosyncratic off-the-cuff things without giving them too much thought about the ramifications of some of their choices. My impetuous father always believed that in life you needed to make decisions promptly, as otherwise the opportunity might abandon you like a balloon on the wind and fly away. He had learnt that growing up to his disadvantage when his ambiguous parents failed to make any prompt decisions in regards to his own life. They had missed out on buying a phenomenal home once because his father had dilly-dallied about whether to put an offer in on the place or not, so in the end they'd brought a much more mediocre home. Another time his parents had vacillated about what holiday destination to choose. They dithered so much in finalising their arrangements, so in the end they had to settle for a less than adequate holiday that still had available bookings, that ended up being less than satisfactory, with inadequate accommodation, abysmal service, poor food, and bedbugs in the bed. My father never forgot the ambivalence of his parents. It cost his family much in his young life. So now he had his favourite saying, which was, "If you snooze, you lose." The thing that disturbed me the most about the property we had purchased was that no one knew what had happened to the previous owners, as by all accounts they had fled the property, were registered as missing, presumed dead as far as I can gather. They had never even accessed even their bank accounts, or been in touch with any family members. I mean, how do 4 people vanish off the face of the earth just like that, without so much as a trace? It does leave you pondering as to what on earth could have happened to them. The 1870 property was auctioned by the bank, and was in a dreadful state of disrepair. Luckily the roof was still in good condition, which was its only saving grace, but many of the structural walls were crumbling, while the wooden windows had warped, twisted and buckled, and the floorboards had become badly damaged. The haunting property still contained the previous owner's furniture, that was once grandiose for its time, but now stuck in a 1970s time warp. Many of the upholstered furnishings were now threadbare. A family of mice were happily nesting in the confines of the settee. The once beautiful Persian rugs had been completely devoured by insatiable carpet moths. The place was caked with dust that was so thick you could write your name in it. Then there were mouse droppings, insect skeletons, and cobwebs everywhere. The most haunting thing of all was that the dining room table was still set for what must have been their last supper, as if something quite dreadful must have happened while they were eating their dinner. Dried up butternut squash appeared to be on their dinner plates, which gave me a horrible chill down my spine. What had happened that night to this poor innocent family? Whatever it was, it must have been quite terrible, I thought. I had discovered some airy photographs of the family lying around the place. They looked like decent people, a mother, a father, a boy and a girl, of similar ages to me and my sister Janice, between the ages of 11 and 13. But apart from a few fleeting photographs, some comic books and an old game of snakes and ladders, we knew nothing about the mysterious family that had previously lived in our home. We were exceedingly fortunate, if you can look at it from that perspective, that the property went for a song. My father snapped it up as quickly as possible. He was a master builder who'd built many wealthy people their dream home, from start to finish in all parts of America, from California to New York, Atlanta and Boston. So as a family we'd moved around a lot, as he was in building construction. He was determined to build us the quintessential asymmetrical contemporary modern home that we all hankered for, and so that is what he did. The kind with seamless finishes, a flat roof and extensive large living areas with huge floor-to-ceiling windows. My father was determined to make the house blend seamlessly into the environment, with a focus on maximising the panoramic views of the breathtaking countryside, which included the undulating contours of the mountains that dappled the distant horizon in a magnificent purple smoky haze. Then there were the verdant rolling hills, the pretty flowery meadows, the sculptural rocky outcrops, the enchanting silvery pond that was lavishly bespeckled with water lilies and teeming with frogs and fish. And last but not least, the viridescent forest that consisted primarily of maples and oak trees, which was teeming with an abundance of wildlife and a thriving deer population. Of course, my parents wanted to add all the extra niceties to the building project that had become much more recently fashionable, and of course added to the value and prestige of our home, rather like a dressing room for my mother, with a walk-in wardrobe and a stylish open-plan kitchen fitted with top-of-the-range kitchen units and granite surfaces, and of course sliding doors that opened out onto a sprawling entertainment area. The property was located on 40 acres of overgrown rambling brush. Grotesque, ugly-looking weeds and creeping variegated vines had spiralled their way through the old driveway and around the house, transforming the yard into a dense jungle and rambunctious thicket, so my father had to hire a landscape gardener to transform the yard. Let's just say it was a mammoth project, and the landscape gardener had to make a plethora of trips to the dump, as there was so much yard waste. At first glance I was absolutely furious that my dad had bought such a sinister-looking property that just looked creepy and oppressive. It was hard for me to see the potential of something as hideously ugly as this vacant home. It truly looked like a derelict haunted location, hardly the kind of property I'd be pleased to call home. Also, knowing that something dreadful may have happened to the previous occupants did nothing to dull my deep cynicism about my father's impulsive purchase. While the building was in progress, we stayed in a trailer on the premises. There were many times I cursed the very day my father had taken on such a long-suffering building project. I think we all felt the same way. I assure you there's nothing more tedious than waking up every morning to the sounds of workmen knocking away and hammering at chipboard, while you live a cramped life cooped up in a trailer. It was hard for me to see my father's vision for the place. All I could see was a huge mess and an overgrown jungle. But I'm glad to say, to my father's credit, he had a great vision, as we saw the old dilapidated building beginning to take on some pleasing shapes. When parts of the old house were in the throes of being demolished, we noticed other details about the house that we'd previously overlooked. There were some deep, angry gashes that could be seen all over the wooden panels of the house, almost as if someone had deliberately tried to vandalize the place. There were several windows that had been broken through and heavily boarded up from the inside out by the previous owners, almost as if they'd been trying to keep something out. Even crazier were the inside doors that were bolted up like Fort Knox with double locks. There were metal-barred security gates erected on the inside of every bedroom. The kitchen back door and the front door as well. I don't know why we'd overlooked these minor details that didn't seem so minor at all in the grand overall scheme of things. Whoever had owned this house had gone to extreme lengths in regards to their stringent security measures, which seemed excessive for an idyllic location like the Blue Ridge Mountains. Something must have freaked the family out so significantly. For whatever it was, I hoped and prayed that it wouldn't come after us. On the 25th of February 2014, we'd finally moved into our beautiful new home and were no longer residing in the trailer. But it was on March the 3rd, 2014, when our area was hit with the most terrible heavy snow, sleet and frozen rain. And areas around our home like Oklahoma, New Jersey and Virginia were hit really badly. There were major problems in the Blue Ridge Mountain area and the Shenandoah Valley, including the Richmond area, as well as Interstates 81 and 64. So we were very badly affected by the extreme weather and suffered the ravages of sub-zero conditions, so our family was pretty much snowed in. The house was very warm, my mother busied herself making warming meals for us, and there was a crackling fire blazing away in the living room, keeping the house snug and cosy. I remember it was a bitterly cold winter's day, but as the yard had recently been renovated and completely cleared out, me and my sister Janice had discovered a lovely hilly slope at the far end of our property that was large enough for tobogganing. Despite the horrendous, harrowing weather conditions, we really wanted to try out our hand on the hilly slope. My mother wasn't keen on the idea. She suggested that there would be many other times in the future when the conditions would be less chaotic than they were now, when we could go tobogganing on the hill. But after much begging, she finally agreed, as long as my father would keep a watch over us. Me and Janice wasted no time in racing outdoors, warmly dressed in our anoraks, woolly hats, scarves and boots. I still remember how dreadfully cold it was. I could feel the icy sleet numbing my face. I knew my mother was right. These conditions were very crazy for tobogganing. My fingers, even inside my gloves, felt like icicles. But I wasn't going to return indoors with my tail between my legs, admitting that my mother was right. I was adventurous, always had been, and I was hardly going to let the bad weather stop me from having fun. Before long, Janice and I were enjoying ourselves going up and down the hilly slope on our toboggans. We felt exhilarated. Suddenly on my downward ride, I hit something hard that was sticking out of the snow and went flying in the air like a frisbee, finally landing on the soft snow in the lower valley beneath us. I'm glad to say that all that was wounded was my pride. I had landed in a crumpled heap at the bottom of the slope. My father was watching us with a look of amusement. I think he found my fall rather funny. He wasted no time in rushing up the hilly slope to investigate what it was that had tripped me up on my downhill ride. We discovered the end of a long pole of some kind jutting out of the hilly outcrop through to the exposed snow. We were curious to find out what it was. My father thought it was some kind of marker. He got his trowels out from the shed and proceeded to dig around the large pole. He dug away large layers of snow and dirt. We found ourselves faced with the most god-awful stench of such I do not have words in my vocabulary to describe. The undeniable smell of decaying flesh hit our nostrils hard. Whatever we were smelling must have been dead for quite a while. Suddenly my father's trowel hit a large hairy hand. I heard him say, "What the heck is this?" He continued to dig until the body of a large hairy monster was revealed. The creature looked mummified, but it was in remarkably good condition to be able to see very clearly, despite having been dead for so long and smelling deplorable. This strange, hideous, humanoid-looking beast, whatever in God's name it actually was covered all over its body from top to bottom with thick, dark brown hair, apart from the hairless face. The head was an unusual dome shape. It was literally attached to these humongous, rounded shoulders. The human-like face looked like it was weathered and old, because the protruding forehead was filled with deep, dense furrows. The skin was thickly textured like a rhino hide. The dead eyes stared up at us vacantly. They were a dark brown colour. But why were the eyes not empty sockets after all this time? Surely they should have been eaten by worms. None of this made any sense to us at all. The nose was so flat and squashed, it reminded me of a pug. The lips were thin, but when you pushed the lips back like I did with a piece of a twig, I could tell the creature had large teeth that were like humans, only much, much bigger. It was peculiar because the creature appeared mummified, solid like stone. But maybe it hadn't been there long. We couldn't be sure. The whole thing was an enigmatic mystery, that left us with more questions than answers. However, the thing that had me and my father in total awe was the size of this monstrous beast. It was titanic in its proportions, even in death. It was giant-like. My father said he must be about 9 foot tall, and easily about 800 pounds or even more. The creature was solid, stocky and muscular, with exceedingly long arms and human-like hands and feet, with smooth nail beds. Bear in mind we'd never heard of a Bigfoot before, but one thing for certain, this creature looked half human and half ape. We were certain it was some kind of primate. We found the whole body was riddled with bullets from top to bottom, as if someone had been using him for target practice. However, it didn't take much for us to realize that it could have been the previous owner of the property that may have been the one who had killed this creature, which may well have terrorized him and his family. We could see, if it was alive, it would have been an apex predator, and certainly a formidable foe. Maybe this creature was the reason why the previous owners had gone to such lengths to secure their property and board up their windows. We couldn't be sure. But surely if it had been buried for so long, the body would have decayed. Instead, it seemed mummified. My father thought it might have something to do with the dryness and acidity of the soil that had prevented the body from decomposing, and that seemed like a plausible explanation to me. My father was dumbfounded by what we were seeing. As far as we could see, this creature was not known by science. My father felt we should notify the authorities about this strange animal that we'd found. We believed we had discovered an unidentified species, and also this formidable-looking creature could unravel the mystery of the family that had disappeared from this location. Well, so we thought. I heard my father on the telephone telling the police what we'd found, and then we were put through to the sheriff. To cut a long story short, the next thing we knew, a black van drove up our drive and asked us to show them the body of the strange creature. We noticed 2 men in black suits got out of the van. Within seconds they placed the dead creature in a body bag, then on a gurney, and popped it in the back of the van, and proceeded to hurriedly drive down our drive, even in those treacherous conditions, like a bat out of hell. It all happened so fast that we just went with the flow. We didn't ask any awkward questions. Another dark car arrived 5 minutes later. 2 military men, heavily armed with large rifles, went to investigate the wooded area on our property. They did a thorough search, seemed fully satisfied, sped away in the truck as fast as they'd come. It was all rather mysterious, I thought. Were they looking for more of these anomalous creatures, I wondered. The following day my father phoned the police to ask whether the unusual, outlandish creature that we had discovered had been identified. We were told it was a misidentification on our parts. The creature we had found was a bear. My father was furious about being fobbed off like that. He knew the creature we'd seen was definitely not a bear. "I think there's some weird kind of cover-up going on," he said. "I want to get to the bottom of it." I remember my father made some phone calls to find out what was going on. One day a very smart, opulent-looking limousine drove down our driveway at one hell of a speed. 2 small men in tight suits with dark glasses that were too big for their faces got out of the car. I was standing in the doorway. They asked me if they could speak to my father at once. The men were standoffish rude. Their tones were abrasive and curt, very businesslike, I thought. I noticed the skin on their faces was hauntingly white, so white that it didn't look natural or even human. They both sat on the edges of the upholstered chairs in our living room, and my father said they seemed hostile, cold, and very unfriendly. The one man said to my father, "We understand, Mr. Donahue, that you are causing a great deal of problems, asking all kind of awkward questions, stirring up a lot of discord. That's not a very nice thing to be doing, is it, Mr. Donahue? No one likes to have their feathers ruffled, do they? If you must know, I'm only trying to find out why there's a cover-up going on. I keep being told the creature we found in the snow was a bear. I assure you it was no bear. It had hands, it didn't have paws." "Mr. Donahue," said one of the men, "if you open your mouth about what you saw, there will be big trouble. You think the people that lived in this house of yours disappeared by accident? There are no accidents in this world, Mr. Donahue. But there are arranged accidents when people fail to comply with the rules. Then those people get eliminated. We wouldn't like that to happen to your lovely little family, would we? I see you have a very nice little daughter out there. I'm sure you would like her to have a good, long life. One day get married, have children of her own. I'm sure you're looking forward to being grandparents one day. You wouldn't want anything to jeopardize that for you, would you? Are you threatening me? My father asked, his back stiffening. Now, who said anything about threatening you, Mr. Donahue? No one is threatening you. We're only telling you what you already know. The creature you found in the snow that was taken away was a bear. We do not want you to go spreading around unlikely rumours, do we, Mr. Donahue? So you want me to pretend the creature I saw was a bear? Mr. Donahue, I'd like to make things very clear to you. The creature you found buried on the hilly slope was a bear. We would appreciate it greatly if you didn't discuss the matter further. Or the next time we visit you, things won't be so rosy. We'll see ourselves out now. Good day to you, Mr. Donahue. My father watched the men leaving, his face drained of colour. I could see he was trembling. Is everything all right? My mother asked. She looked at my father with a perturbed expression on her face. You look as if you've seen a ghost, sweetheart. What did those men want with you? They seem terribly official, rather like government agents. I don't know who they are, but I would appreciate it if we never talk about the strange creature we found in the ice anymore. I think it's safe to say it was a bear. But it wasn't a bear, said my mother. My father virtually growled at my mother. It was a bear, he insisted. One day I happened to bring up the subject again about the quirky creature we had uncovered that freezing winter's day. My father told us we were never to mention the subject ever again, under any circumstances, nor tell anybody what we'd seen. It was a year later, in March of 2017, we had an outlandish visitor to our home. He was a small man under 5 foot tall, with a square jawline and piercing brown eyes that were so sharp like a fearsome bird of prey. He asked if he could see my parents. My father ushered him into the kitchen, offering him a cup of coffee. He refused and asked for a mug of warm milk instead. I won't beat around the bush, he said, but it came to my attention that last year on your premises you discovered the deceased body of a Sasquatch that was later taken away by the authorities, who have asked you to brush the secret under the carpet. Am I right about this or not? Sorry, who are you? Asked my father, looking awkward. I could tell he was becoming nervous, passing my mother surreptitious sideways glances. It doesn't matter who I am. Is this story true or not? No, said my father. I do not know where you heard such outrageous claims. We did find the body on a hill a year ago, but I assure you it was only a bear. We never found a Sasquatch. I'm not even sure such an anomalous creature even exists here in North America. The man drank down his milk, leaving a rim of white froth around his dark moustache. Very good. That's what I needed to hear. You saw a bear. Don't you ever forget that it was a bear. And then he was gone like that. You see what I mean, said my father. I repeat, we must never talk about the strange creature we found buried on that hill. Someone out there is watching us. They're making sure we keep our mouths shut. They mean business. Fast forward to 2018, 4 years after our discovery of the strange hairy creature buried in our yard. I remember it was a gloriously warm, sunny day. I was lying on a towel on the grass next to my sister Janice. We were lying at the edge of the woodgrove on our lawn, which was always superbly mowed by my father. I suddenly had this horrible feeling that I was being studied by a pair of keen, curious eyes. But as I looked around our yard, I could see nothing there. I think something's watching us, I told my sister Janice, but she looked up and glanced towards the trees and said there was nothing there, that I was imagining things, but I knew I wasn't. I could tell something was spying on us. I thought it might be the kids from next door neighbour's property, as on many occasions we had spotted them playing in our woodgrove. My father turned a blind eye to it. He was good friends with their father. I think it's one of the neighbourhood kids, I whispered. I was half expecting to hear some boyish giggles or to find ourselves being suddenly sprayed by water pistols, but everything was serene and peaceful, yet I still felt as if I was being studied. But I pushed aside those nagging thoughts. I told myself I was just being silly. "Are you hungry?" I asked my sister, opening the picnic basket my mother had packed for us. I pulled out a Tupperware container of sandwiches, handed my sister a ham and pickle sandwich. We began to eat our sandwiches and talk. Then my sister said, "I think you're right. Something is watching us. Over there, behind that tree. I'm sure I saw a movement." "Where?" I asked my sister. "Over there, to the right." "That's a tree stump," I told her. But then the tree stump moved. My sister was right. I adjusted my eyes to the light. I could see a pair of treacle-brown eyes staring at us from about 7 feet off the ground. Then we saw her. I think she wanted us to see her. She was no longer attempting to hide from us. She was definitely female, not only because of her breasts, but her feminine energy as well. I was amazed that she was almost identical to the creature we'd found buried in the snow 4 years earlier. I couldn't help wondering if she was related to it in any way. The creature was similar to the one we'd found, only she would have been a lot smaller, weighed half as much, but she was still very big. I hasten to say that the creature seemed amused by the way I was eating my sandwich. She started to mimic me. She was a brilliant actress. She pretended to be eating a sandwich. I stood there staring at her in awe. I thought she seemed like a gentle soul. Not once did she threaten me or my sister, or give us any cause to feel afraid. She stared at us with brown congenial eyes that looked comical. Then she scratched her head thoughtfully for a moment. After a while she vanished like a ghost. We were disappointed that she had gone. We had enjoyed our interaction with her. Of course we told my parents what we'd seen. My father was visibly upset. "I don't want you to speak of these creatures to anyone. No one must know what you've seen. We don't want trouble coming our way." One day the neighbour's mother popped around to our house unexpectedly, which was a turn-up for the books. She's a lovely lady called Sheila, but shy, self-effacing and reticent, so my mother was surprised to see her. She'd invited Sheila to our home on numerous occasions before, but she'd always politely declined all our invitations. We knew her to be quite reclusive. Everyone accepted in town that she was a hermit. My mother had met her only once before, and on seeing Sheila at our front door, was really rather bewildered. She said that the woman seemed nervous and on edge, so she offered Sheila a chair in our kitchen. "I must apologise for my kids always playing in your woodgrove," she said. "I hope they're not too much of a nuisance." "They're welcome to play there," said my mother, "any time. Your woods are spectacular." "Well, they are pretty special," my mother agreed. "Sometimes I take our dogs there for a walk. It's lovely in there, so peaceful. A sanctuary, especially in summer." The woman paused. She twiddled her fingers awkwardly. Her lips tightened. "You do know you have a Bigfoot living in your woodgrove?" "Oh," said my mother, raising a brow. "Don't look worried. She's a gentle giant. My children found her nesting area recently, the place where she sleeps." "Oh," said my mother, not knowing what else to say. "Well, that's the reason why I'm here, really. I'm worried about the welfare of the Bigfoot. I know she might look intimidating and scary, but I'd hate something bad to happen to her. I'm looking out for her interests, you see. I'd hate your husband to kill her." "Well, why would he do that?" my mother asked. Because people do crazy things when they're scared. I worry if your husband was to see her, he might feel the need to shoot her, based on how large she is. But I want to assure you she's a benign creature. She would never harm us. In truth, we're a lot safer out there with her watching over us. Much safer, actually." "Well, that's an interesting way to look at it," my mother said. "Well, you know, you may be wondering why I keep myself to myself. I'm very reclusive, I admit, and I'm sorry that I have declined many of your invitations over the years. I know it may seem awfully rude of me, but it's nothing personal, I assure you. Of course, some people have taken offence to my rejections. I wish they wouldn't." "I realise that," said my mother. "I knew you must have your reasons for being so private." Sheila looked grateful. "I'm glad you see it like that. You're a very perceptive woman." I haven't got agoraphobia. It's not as bad as that. But I do have a nervous condition brought on by post-traumatic stress that has kept me a prisoner in my own home. I'm fortunate to be married to Miles. He's a very understanding, loving man. You may have noticed he does all the shopping, takes the kids to school for me and church, so that I can stay safely at home. May I ask you what happened to bring about your post-traumatic stress disorder? Of course, if you don't want to tell me, I'll fully understand. I was raped, attacked by a strange man when I was about 22 years old. I was taking a shortcut to my home through a heavily wooded area. This young man pounced on me from behind the bushes. He had dark hair and a long bushy black beard. I think he was round about my age. I remember he smelt of body odour. His bedraggled clothes suggested to me that he slept rough. His breath reeked of booze. It was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. One minute you're walking peacefully in the woods, the next minute someone is on top of you, holding you at knife point and telling you to shut up or they'll kill you. My mother gasped, cupping her hands over her mouth. How horrifying! I don't know what to say. It could have been a lot worse. The young man could have killed me, but he didn't get the chance. She lowered her voice into a quiet whisper. I was saved by a Sasquatch. You mean a Bigfoot saved you? Well, I was fighting for my life as the man was raping me. I was screaming. Suddenly a big black creature appeared through the bushes, lifted the man off me. He ripped off this man's head, throwing it across the forest floor like a soccer ball. I was stunned. The creature was so kind. She was also female, very protective towards me. She knew at once that the man who had attacked me had meant to harm me. I quickly got dressed as most of my clothes had been ripped off by him. That Bigfoot escorted me through the woods. I never saw her again, but I never ever forgot her kindness. You don't forget it when something saves your life like that. Do you think the man would have killed you? My mother asked. I don't know. It's possible. I remember looking into his eyes when he was attacking me. He looked so soulless. Maybe he would have killed me to cover up his iniquitous secret. I don't know. It's something that haunts me to this day. Did you report the incident to the police? My mother asked. No. Are you mad? Of course I didn't. I was 22 years old at the time. I felt incredibly ashamed, embarrassed, humiliated even, as if it was all my fault. When you're that age, you can be very secretive and very self-conscious. I have no idea who the rapist was, but I do know his dismembered body was found in the woods. I will say this, I felt no empathy for him. He was a monster with a heart of stone. No one who does that is a human. And you've lived with the secret for so long? Sheila nodded, the tears pouring down her face like raindrops. My husband knows the story, of course. Naturally, he's thrilled the monster that attacked me is dead. We both have a soft spot for Sasquatch and the circumstances. I know there are stories out there that are horrendous, but my experience of these creatures has been favourable. You must excuse my impertinence, but don't you think you should have some kind of trauma counselling in the circumstances? That way you might have more confidence to live a normal life, to get out more, even go on holiday perhaps with your husband and kids. My husband's been begging me to have trauma counselling for years. It is something I am considering. It's a great idea. It must get awfully lonely for you tucked away in your home like that. If you need a friend, I'd be more than happy to come around and visit you. You would? Of course, said my mother, squeezing Sheila's hand tightly. Going back to the Bigfoot in the woods, you don't want to worry about that. I understand why you're so protective of her. My children encountered her one day when they were sunbathing and eating sandwiches. They saw a female Bigfoot copying them eating their sandwiches, but she was very evasive. That's her. I saw her once gliding past my window. We had a moment when our eyes met. She reminded me of the Bigfoot that saved me. I feel so much safer knowing she's out there, but you don't want my husband to shoot her. That's right. I can't help worrying about that. I have sleepless nights about it. You've nothing to worry about, Sheila, I assure you. My husband would never just kill an innocent creature for no reason at all. There'd have to be a good reason before he literally shot something. To cut a long story short, we still keep our mouths zipped about the creature we found frozen in ice. To this day, we don't know why the previous owners vanished from our home. The good news is that Sheila is receiving counselling. Over the last couple of years, she and my mother have grown very close. As for the Bigfoot female, she does have a male partner now. On occasion, we have spotted them both in our wood grove. I believe Sheila's right. Those creatures are benign. They're watching our back, and they are no threat to us at all. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Steve, but the story I'm going to tell you needs to remain anonymous for my own personal protection. I cannot give you names, places or dates, but I will tell you my extraordinary Bigfoot encounter because I'm absolutely certain it would be of great interest to your audience of listeners. I have been working for a fire department in North America for many long years now. My father is now a retired fire chief, and as a kid growing up, I always hung around the fire station after school, during the weekends and school holidays, as I was equally as passionate about being a fireman as my father was, and maybe even more so. I would spend countless hours at the fire station, shining the fire engines up with cleaning cloths, buffing them up so that the beautiful red and silver metal literally gleamed and sparkled to a perfect shine, so much so that you could literally see your own reflection staring back at you. I would sit in the fire engine on the driver's seat with my tiny little hands on the steering wheel, making all those brumming sounds with my mouth and envisaging myself driving this marvellous piece of machinery one day. When I was a little older, I worked as a volunteer firefighter, but I never worked at my father's station because of the fear of being accused of nepotism. Finally, I did actually get a job as a full-time firefighter, and my dream came into fruition. Believe me when I say it is not a job for the faint-hearted. The men who work in this business are both passionate, dedicated, courageous individuals whom are willing to work demanding and grueling 24-hour shifts. Being a fireman is usually born from an intense desire and drive to help people in all kinds of eventualities, many times choosing to save people's lives at the very risk of losing your own. Truly, there is nothing more satisfying to me in this world than saving someone's life. It makes my life so worthwhile, rewarding and fulfilling. I have so many stories to tell of people that our fire brigade has miraculously saved, that were seemingly situations so devoid of any hope. This would have invariably amounted to horrifying consequences too dreadful to even comprehend. So many firefighters possess this incredible, remarkable, fast, quick-witted, creative and ingenious thinking that really does contribute greatly to saving so many lives. My job involves responding to fires, explosions, car accidents and medical emergencies. We spend ages cleaning our trucks and service equipment, and we often talk to community groups and schools. We teach kids as well as members of the public all about fire safety and what to do if you have an accidental fire at your home, and how to manage the situation lest it gets out of control. Most of the men I work with tend to work 24 hours on and 48 hours off schedules, typically starting and ending shifts at about 7 a.m. The first thing we do on a shift is to ensure that all our equipment, like our trucks and breathing apparatus, are in apple pie order. We then tend to engage in an hour of physical fitness daily to make sure we keep in great physical shape for the demands of our jobs, because believe me, you do not want to be out of shape when you're tackling a challenging fire, because dealing with that intense heat and the physical exertion can take exhaustion to a whole new level. We also do our bit at the fire department to help in disaster relief, like ice storms, wildfires and hurricanes. And of course, our jobs are not without major risks. And on average, I have to say that about 10 firefighters lose their lives tragically in North America every year. And these men are truly fallen heroes, in my opinion. My story begins when we were called out to an area of natural forest where many campers were being trapped by the ravages of a wild, rampant, orange-red fiery inferno that was spreading dangerously fast, literally carpeting the entire valley with blankets of thick velvet black smoke that was curling, rolling and folding down the natural timber like pieces of tissue paper. The first thing we did as a team was to douse the existing fire with water and spray down the area with fire retardants. It was a tough job and exhausting work. People were being rescued from areas totally overwhelmed with the hot inferno. Many survivors were being evacuated by helicopters, and for many witnesses, they described what they saw as being like Armageddon. Being caught up in a forest fire is a terrifying ordeal for people, and sometimes even the fear associated with the terror can be more deadly than the fire itself. As firefighters, we are equipped to deal with these harrowing, treacherous experiences with a steely courage and conviction. As I was dousing the fire, I noticed a bedraggled heap of what I can only describe as a mass of singed hair lying in the corner under a tree, barely breathing. I suddenly noticed that the strange hairy form appeared to be moving, and so I dashed over to what I assumed was a person wearing a somewhat peculiar looking fuzzy coat of some kind to give them the emergency life-saving help that they invariably needed. I realized almost immediately that this human was actually covered in real hair, and so it couldn't be human at all. But what was it? I could not imagine. In that moment I did not care, because my sole intention was to save this humanoid hairy form, regardless of what it was. The creature was about 4 feet tall, 300 pounds, and covered in hair that was singed by the fire and smelt burnt. To my horror, the poor creature was barely conscious, with seriously impaired, very shallow breathing, and there was a clear evidence of soot around the nose and mouth area. The creature's brown eyes were rolling back in their sockets, not a good sign, and it appeared both confused and disorientated. I immediately called Michelle, an EMT I often worked with in emergency situations, and whom I knew extremely well. We put the creature out of harm's way, away from all the prying eyes, behind some trees that had not been damaged by the fire, and on an open clearing that had been saturated with lots of water. Michelle was whispering to me and looking at me with a look of deep concern growing on her face. "Do not tell anyone about this," she said, looking at me intently with her kind blue eyes. "If the government finds out about this creature, they will definitely kill him. They don't want the public to know that it exists. We need to help it, or it will die." I looked at Michelle with a look of confusion on my face. "Michelle," I said, "what in God's name are you talking about? You're not making any sense at all." "Look," said Michelle, "can you not see? This creature is not human. I'm almost certain it's a little Bigfoot." I was stunned. I watched Michelle examining the creature and measuring its vitals and administering oxygen to the animal. The creature was in a very bad way, and I truly thought it wasn't going to pull through. It looked like the life was literally ebbing from its body, and it seemed to be deteriorating rapidly. And when this happens, you usually get the most grim outcome you can imagine, and the creature normally dies. But Michelle continued to oxygenate the creature's blood until it started splattering and coughing violently, and a black coal-like tar emerged from its mouth. I suddenly had this very strange feeling that I was being watched. Michelle and I looked up, and we both saw this monstrous-looking creature standing behind a tree, watching us intently with a look of heightened concern on its face. I realized almost immediately that this was the Bigfoot's mother, who was clearly terrified about losing her child. She watched us closely, seemingly unfazed that we could see her so clearly. On the contrary, she wanted us to know that she was there, waiting for her child. She seemed to understand that we were doing our level best to save its life. I looked up at her only very briefly, as I was so intent on helping the little Bigfoot to recover and regain full consciousness, because there was no way we could take this strange humanoid to the hospital in an ambulance without drawing too much unwelcome attention to the creature, and that's the last thing we wanted to do. The mother Bigfoot was absolutely enormous. She must have been 8 foot tall and 700 pounds, and she was covered in coal-black hair from head to foot. It was clear that she was female, not only because of her gentle feminine energy, but her pert breast tissue on her chest told me that she was definitely female. She stood there watching us continuously with very soft brown eyes. She had a cone-shaped head that had a tiny little point on the top, and blended seamlessly into a pair of enormous shoulders. The creature was in far better shape than many of the firefighters that work at our station, because every part of her body rippled with muscle, and she was shredded and ripped. Her arms were long like that of a primate, but they were exceedingly strong and muscular like that of a very strong man. In a nutshell, she looked like a humanoid ape. As the creature coughed, it spat out a lot more of that nasty-looking black-like soot, and suddenly it seemed to come out of its confused state, and its little frightened brown eyes looked up at us in surprise, with a look of confusion all over its face. Almost immediately the mother started chattering away to the creature in some kind of strange language that sounded remarkably like gibberish. However, what she was saying to the little Bigfoot enabled him to physically relax and almost immediately calm down. He seemed to surrender comfortably to the help we were administering to him without any resistance. Much to my relief, the oxygen therapy we gave the creature and the medication clearly brought it out of its confused state very fast, and before long it got up and ran into its mother's arms. The reunion between the two was so touching that I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes. The mother ran her huge humanoid hands through the little creature's hair, pulling away some of the black muck entangled within its hairy layers, and she wet her fingers with her pink tongue and wiped the black soot away from the little creature's mouth area with a very large finger. The little creature rubbed its little hairy face into its mother's downy stomach and clutched its mother's arm tightly with its hands. I looked up, and the mother Bigfoot looked directly at me and held my gaze, and in that moment it appeared that she was painting a picture in my mind. Suddenly I saw it very clearly. It was a vivid picture of a little Bigfoot sitting on a tree, waiting for its mother to return. I then felt this gratitude and thankfulness flood over me. It was like this Bigfoot mother was telling me that she had left her baby up in the tree and asked him to wait there for her, which it had done dutifully, to its own peril, which was why it got ravaged by that horrible fire. It truly felt that she was thanking us for our fast intervention in saving her child's life. All I can say is this: I have never experienced anything like this before. I believe it was telepathic communication, and to affirm it, Michelle had also received exactly the same message from the Bigfoot mother when she had looked directly into both of our eyes. The Bigfoot mother then nodded to us and turned around with her little child's legs wrapped around her hips and shoulders. We watched her glide away into the forests, and she moved with such agility and grace. She was so beautiful to watch, and I shed a happy tear as I watched them go. "Thank you," said Michelle, looking at me gratefully. "Thank you so much for your discretion. I never knew that Bigfoot was real until a few moments ago. But I knew if this got out, that we had found a Bigfoot child, I'm almost certain that the government would have sworn everyone to secrecy and maybe eliminated the creature. I couldn't let that happen to him. He deserves to live in peace and be reunited with his mother, like he happily is now. Look how happy and grateful she was." "I wholeheartedly agree," I said. "I'm glad we've kept this secret." I walked away from that experience thrilled to have saved the Bigfoot's life and to have encountered two seemingly serene, very gentle creatures that are formidable but majestic at the same time. It did make me realize that there is much more to this world than we imagine, and that we need to preserve and protect our forests so that these elusive, wonderful creatures can thrive. They deserve respect and to be treated with compassion because they're extraordinary, remarkable, and intelligent creatures. I do not want your listeners to think that fires are all bad news, because they can have invaluable benefits to the earth, like cracking seeds open to encourage germination in the fertile, ashy ground. It also destroys the thick understory in the forest, which reduces competition for seedlings, encouraging new growth and providing food for animals. Having said all that, the increase in wildfires in recent years has been attributed to global warming, and sometimes the damage on the ground can be so severe that it loses its ability to retain fluid, causing loss of vegetation and damage to lakes and rivers. I must confess that on the subject of the hairy humanoid known as Bigfoot, I truly never considered the existence of such a creature remotely plausible. But now I realize that I was very wrong. This creature is real. It gives me a greater determination to preserve our forests more than ever before here in North America, keeping the natural habitat of these forests thriving and abundant for these beautiful and majestic creatures. Thank you so very much, Steve, for such an amazing story. Tonight's story is one of 4 letters that come all the way from Russia with 4 separate accounts of Bigfoot encounters. So let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Olga, and on my father's side of the family, we're all previously from Russia, and I want to assure you that not every Russian woman is trying to snag an American man for herself, which is just one of those awful stereotypes that doesn't carry much weight and that most Russians absolutely hate. Although let's face it, who in their right mind wouldn't want a green card? America and Canada are the most stunningly beautiful countries in the entire world, but then I am exceedingly biased because I am half American. My mother, for example, is a fully fledged American Southern belle who met my father when he was working for the American Embassy out here, and they bumped into each other on the street. By random chance. It was raining cats and dogs on that day, and my mother was getting soaked in her thin cotton dress that clung to her body like a wet rag. My father described her as looking so bedraggled that she looked exactly like a drowned kitten. Naturally, being the gentleman he was, he wasted no time in offering her cover and shelter under his umbrella. He then asked her to join him for a coffee. She could not resist the lure of his Russian charm and sexy accent, and so the rest is history. They fell in love and subsequently got married. 2 years later, I was born in Washington State, where I now currently reside. Russians have a reputation for being aggressive, being atrocious drivers, drinking excessive amounts of vodka, saying exactly what they think, and being communists. But not all of those stereotypes are actually true, although the driving one and saying what you think may be. However, I so often get asked by American friends of mine, and especially about the Russian bride stuff, which they tease me relentlessly about. I'm always being told that Russian women infinitely prefer American men. But I promise you, if you walk down the streets of Russia today, you will see many happy Russian couples and women who would never consider looking elsewhere for love. It is true that young people in Russia are exceedingly ambitious and really want to aspire to great and big things. Life is much easier in Russia today than it was in my grandmother's generation. People pretty much have everything these days, especially if they work in the big cities. In my grandmother's day, people were poorer but a whole lot happier and much more satisfied with their lives. It seems as if there is a growing restlessness among the Russian youth today, as if they're searching for something that they just cannot find. The more materialistic they become, the less fulfilled and enriched they feel. This is very noticeable to my grandmother's generation, who watch their children's children with raised eyebrows, secretly wondering if all this exponential growth in materialism has any long-lasting value at all. My Bigfoot encounter happened when I visited my grandmother on my father's side at her home in the Russian countryside. Life in the Russian countryside has really changed over the years. Nowadays, all the young people gravitate towards the main towns like Moscow and St. Petersburg, and more people have left their country villages behind. You can find some villages today feeling like ghost towns, with some homes even being left abandoned. The younger generation love buying houses in the countryside, but it invariably needs to be in close proximity to the main towns and is ideally used as a weekend retreat. The further away you live, the less value your property holds. So in commercial real estate, it truly is a case of location every time, as is the case almost anywhere else in the world. As recently as the early 60s and 70s, those villages were teeming with people who would get up as early as 4 o'clock in the morning to fire up their ovens, as they didn't have any gas connections in those days. The local people needed to eat, so it was something everyone had to do back then. You can only imagine how stifling hot the homes would become in the middle of summer. My gran said you would literally roast like a pig on a spit. People in those days interacted much better than they do today, and everybody knew each other. Nowadays, some Russians in their villages have actually gone to the extent of putting up iron fences around their homes, and sadly, some of them don't even know their neighbours, but this usually happens among the younger generation. The village where my grandmother lives in Russia is very rural and very remote, and is fortunately bustling with activity from the locals who raise turkeys, pigs, chickens, goats, and even cows, and they all grow a lot of their own vegetables, especially tons and tons of potatoes. When I arrived in Russia for a months-long holiday to spend with my grandmother in the Russian countryside, I was 29 at the time, and it was in 2015. I had never met my grandmother in my life, nor had I ever visited Russia before, so I had no idea what to expect about this great country. When I visited her, I was amazed how humble my grandmother's lifestyle was, and how self-sufficient she was, and it rather reminded me of the people in North America who know how to live completely off-grid. My grandmother was elderly, but not in the slightest bit frail. She had meat on her bones and possessed a robust, strong figure. I noticed a limp in her left leg that dragged a little on the ground when she walked. Her weathered, sun-kissed face was dotted with liver spots that were somewhat endearing, as they clearly revealed that life had not always been easy for her. Her rural home was a little run down and faded, and had indeed seen better days. There had been attempts to revitalise the house with a coat of bright pink paint, which did have a brightening effect and really was quite uplifting. She also possessed some really shabby, tired outbuildings where she raises alpine and Anglo-Nubian goats and chickens. Her neighbours raise turkeys and pigs, so the village community actively exchanges their fresh produce among each other, thus enabling greater self-sufficiency. There is a village shop where you can buy all the basics, but the prices there are always spiked, so it's better to do your main shopping in the cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg. However, the village shop is great, and it is useful if you need to buy some bellinis or a quick loaf of bread. The rural houses in my grandmother's village are very open without any boundary walls, and the houses blend seamlessly on a never-ending expanse of open countryside that stretches back for miles, with long grasses and pretty wild flowers growing through this open wilderness. It is an intriguing, picturesque world of goats grazing freely, several calves and even flocks of geese dotted around this vast open expanse. One morning after my grandmother had collected a dozen eggs from her chicken coop, she proceeded to make me the Russian staple breakfast of thin lacy pancakes served with thick sour cream and blueberry jam. Although different to our traditional American pancakes, these tasted delicious, and I do strongly recommend trying them. I want to go to the forest today, she told me, to pick up some wild strawberries. Are you going to come with me? Sure, I said. Why not? I did not require much prodding because I adored strawberries, but I had not heard of wild ones before. So armed with plastic buckets, we ventured into the forest. It was a glorious sunny day with a moderate even temperature, and there was a refreshing cool breeze. The forest was full of lots of tall, slender trees with white bark, and its pretty floors were literally covered with wild strawberries that dangled prettily from the green foliage. I squatted down on my 2 legs and popped a strawberry into my mouth, and it was the sweetest, juiciest strawberry I have ever tasted in my entire life, far superior to what you might buy at your grocery store. I started to gather some strawberries in my bucket, and then I got the very strange feeling that something or someone was watching me. I looked around curiously to see if I could see who it was, but there was nobody there. Shrugging my shoulders and telling myself I was imagining things, I continued to pick the fruit. I suddenly noticed that wild strawberries were being flung into my plastic bucket, almost as if an invisible being was helping me gather fruit. It was really peculiar because I could not see who this individual actually was. I then heard the person whistling, and I thought someone was playing a joke on me.
but as I surveyed the area, I could see no one there. More and more strawberries were being flung into my bucket, without a single miss. It was like watching balls being aimed at a basketball net, seamlessly, without the ball ever missing the perfect sequence. My grandmother was at the other end of the forest picking strawberries, so I couldn't quiz her about my mystery helper, who was enabling my buckets to explode with huge amounts of strawberries, and was throwing them from far away. I looked up again, and I thought I could see some tree branches moving against the wind, unnaturally, so I knew that the person who was helping me gather fruit was hiding over there. I decided to go over and thank this comical man, whoever they were, for helping me. I could see a touch of red hair blazing brightly through the foliage. I knew that there was no one red-headed in our village, so I was eager to meet this new person, whoever they were. As I approached the tree, I saw a huge creature squatting on the ground, and he was covered from head to toe with red hair, much like that of a red setter or a cocker spaniel. The creature was utterly enormous, and he looked like a huge, big, cuddly teddy bear, although this thing was not a bear, but a humanoid ape-like creature. The strange creature looked up at me in total surprise and studied me curiously with bright, amused-looking brown eyes. I realized the creature was a female because she had breasts covered with fur, and she had very long arms that reminded me of a sloth or orangutan, only they were much more muscular. I noticed the head was cone-shaped, and it blended seamlessly into the shoulders, and if there was a neck, it wasn't clearly visible to me. The long face was pinkish-brown, with a distinctive brow ridge, and a flat, large nose, and a slender mouth. Not once did I detect, not even for a single moment, any animosity from the creature, although she was holding the tree branch and twitching it nervously in her humanoid large hands, almost as if she was a little bit on the shy side. For a moment I locked eyes with this creature, and I rarely sensed her warmth and intelligent demeanour. The creature rose up from the ground, and I noticed that she was extraordinarily tall, at about 8 feet and 600 pounds. As she did this, she kept looking at me, and she started to chatter to me, as if she was talking to me, and she sounded like a monkey. I pointed to the buckets of strawberries, and the creature reached out for a handful like it was a box of popcorn, and then squatted again and started to eat the strawberries. And I sat down and joined her, and we were literally yards apart. It was like something in a dream, sitting down near a huge creature like this, eating wild strawberries on the forest floor. It was a magical moment. Even though we were so different, this special moment brought us together as if we had been lifelong friends. It just felt so natural. Suddenly I heard my grandmother's calls, and I just wanted her to shut up and go away. Why did she have to ruin this moment? Imagine for a second something exciting is happening to you when you're watching your favourite sports team that's scoring a goal, and that's the very second when someone starts nagging you or screaming out your name and robbing you of a second in time that you can never ever get back. It was exactly like that. My grandmother came into view, and I heard her saying, "Oh, there you are." I heard a rustle and turned around and could see the creature had vanished like a ghost, and I was so utterly disappointed. This unlikely moment spent in a Russian forest was possibly the best moment in my entire life, now cut so unfairly short and sabotaged totally with the appearance of my grandmother, who normally I would have been thrilled to see. My grandmother looked at me strangely. "You look awfully cross," she said. "No, I'm not," I said defensively. My grandmother looked at my buckets of strawberries. "How did you gather so much so fast?" she said. "I need to bring you strawberry picking more often." As we walked back home, I hardly heard a word my grandmother said, as I kept reviewing the memory of my encounter with this powerful, beautiful creature of such a graceful, gentle, warm energy. What was it, I wondered? I'd never seen such an extraordinary creature before, and as far as I knew, there was no creature like this in North America either. It was then that I remembered all the interest in Bigfoot-like creatures on American television. And then I struck pay dirt. Of course, this creature was a Bigfoot. So they were real. I was amazed. I told my grandmother what I'd seen in the forest because I was bursting to tell her about my strange and wonderful encounter with this curious, hairy, humanoid Bigfoot creature. I was almost certain she was not going to believe me, but I was surprised because she did. "You saw the red-headed giant," she said, looking at me aghast, "and you ate strawberries with her? No wonder you looked so cross when you saw me, because I spoilt your sweet little picnic. You are a very lucky girl," she said, "because the hairy giant that lives in the forest is very elusive and keeps himself or herself to himself, and sightings of him or her are few and far between." "How do you know about these creatures?" I asked in surprise. "Well, dear, I've lived here all my life, and those red-headed giants are very gentle creatures, but exceedingly elusive. People have only had sightings of the creature a handful of times, and you come waltzing over here from America and virtually have a picnic with this thing. What have you got that I haven't?" I smiled smugly to myself, knowing that this creature had squatted down with me to eat strawberries was such a privilege. I was thrilled, moved, and touched, to say the least. I wish I could take a photograph of the creature to show my friends in America, because they would never believe that I had seen a Bigfoot. In America, it's known as a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch or even a Yeti, and people dream of interactions with this creature. "You'll never get a photograph of the creature," said my grandmother. "People have tried before in Russia, and the photographs end up all fuzzy, because the creatures have a natural cloaking device, so no photograph is going to prove its existence, because it will always appear distorted." "Oh, so you mean the photograph will be so out of focus, so you can never prove you actually saw one?" "Exactly. It'll always be blurred, and people will always question a blurred picture and think you're hiding something." "We did have a Bigfoot upset the locals once," said my grandmother. "It was long before you were born. I was about 8 or 9 at the time." "What happened?" I asked. "It was not the red giant, it was another species. There are different kinds of these creatures, you know. I never saw him myself, but one of the locals did at the time, and said the creature looked like the devil himself. He's dead now, but you can speak to his daughter about it. She'll remember the story." I watched my gran putting the strawberries in a huge pot with water and sugar as she started to cook the jam. I could see the red concoction bubbling like a molten volcano on the stove as I listened to my grandmother continue with her story. "I know that was not one night the village won't forget. People were shaken up," she said. "I gather this creature was huge, covered with black hair and glowing red eyes, and it was seen standing over the pigsty with a massive pig in his hands. People were terrified of this thing. I did go and see the lady in question, and she recounted a story which I will send you in my next letter. Until then, I hope your listeners enjoyed my story. Meeting that female Bigfoot changed my life forever. I am now fascinated by Bigfoots and do as much research as I can, and always go back to Russia to get more insight. I still think of this Bigfoot that I met with so much fondness and love, because she was so gentle and so intelligent, and I consider myself to be one of the luckiest people in the world to have ever met her. I gave her the name Autumn because of her beautiful, shining red hair." Isn't that the most wonderful story? Thank you, Olga, so much for sending it to me. You know how lucky you are to sit on a forest floor eating wild strawberries with a red-headed giant like Bigfoot.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.